I am Josephine Caldwell, 62 years old, a retired senior auditor, and somehow still cleaning up the financial and emotional messes my son creates. For years, my white daughter-in-law, Chloe, used her tears as an impenetrable shield, manipulating everyone around her to slowly push my granddaughter, Aaliyah, out of the family. Just last month, at an upscale French restaurant, she tried to corner my 17-year-old granddaughter into signing away her $5 million inheritance, sobbing to the crowd that we were the ones abusing her. I did not yell. I did not argue. I simply slid her forged banking records across the table and watched the federal agents escort her out in handcuffs. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to use cold, hard facts to destroy a manipulator's fake tears. The total collapse of my son's life did not begin in a courtroom or a boardroom. It began exactly at 3:50 in the morning. The jarring ring of the telephone shattered the complete silence of my bedroom. When you reach my age, a phone call in the middle of the night never brings good news. I sat up, switching on the bedside lamp, and pressed the receiver to my ear. Before I could even say hello, Chloe's hysterical wailing blasted through the speaker. "Josephine, you need to get down to the precinct right now!" She was hyperventilating, her voice cracking with dramatic panic. "It is Aaliyah. She stole my diamond earrings, she got completely drunk, and she just crashed my new Range Rover into the neighbor's garage." I did not ask questions. I did not offer comfort. I simply hung up the phone. I threw off the covers, grabbed my heavy wool coat, and picked up my car keys from the dresser. As I drove through the dark, empty streets of Atlanta, my mind worked with the cold precision of an auditor. Aaliyah was 17. She was a straight-A student who spent her weekends volunteering at the community center and reading historical fiction. In all her life, she had never taken a single sip of alcohol, let alone stolen jewelry. The math of Chloe's story simply did not add up. I pulled into the parking lot of the police precinct, the harsh blue and red lights flashing against the brick walls. I pushed through the heavy glass double doors and stepped into the sterile, brightly lit waiting area. The sight that greeted me made my blood run ice cold. There, sitting on a hard metal bench, was my beautiful granddaughter. Her small wrists were locked in heavy steel handcuffs. She was trembling, her face stained with silent tears. And standing just a few feet away was my 40-year-old son, Marcus. But he was not comforting his daughter. Instead, he had his arms wrapped tightly around Chloe, rubbing her shoulders while she buried her face in his chest, performing a perfect symphony of fake breathless sobs. The heavy glass doors of the precinct closed behind me, shutting out the biting chill of the Atlanta night. The inside of the station smelled exactly the way you would expect a stale mixture of cheap floor wax, old coffee, and nervous sweat. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with an irritating buzz, casting a sickly pale glow over the cracked linoleum floor. I did not rush. I did not run in screaming and crying like a frantic grandmother. When you have spent 30 years of your life as a senior auditor tracking down millions of dollars hidden by liars and thieves, you learn to never enter a room without first assessing the board. You look for the power dynamics. You look for the lie. And the lie in this room was glaringly obvious. I stood near the entrance, half hidden by a bulletin board covered in faded wanted posters, and simply watched the scene unfold in the holding area. It was a masterclass in manipulation. There, sitting on a comfortable office chair that had clearly been pulled out from behind the desk just for her, was my daughter-in-law, Chloe. She was clutching a brown paper bag, bringing it to her mouth, and taking loud, exaggerated, ragged breaths. Her blonde hair was perfectly messy, arranged just so to make her look frantic, but still delicate. She was wearing a silk designer robe over her clothes, an accessory chosen specifically to emphasize that she had been violently dragged from her peaceful slumber. Beside her stood Officer Davis, a tall, broad-shouldered white police officer who was hovering over her like a protective guard dog. His voice was soft, cooing to her, offering her a cup of water, his body language entirely focused on shielding this poor, fragile woman from the horrors of the world. And then there was my granddaughter. Aaliyah was sitting on a hard, freezing metal bench bolted to the cinder block wall. She was only 17 years old, barely 110 pounds in her pajamas, but her small wrists were clamped tightly in heavy steel handcuffs. The metal dug into her dark skin. Her head was bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent, breathless sobs. She looked so tiny, so utterly defeated, treated not like a terrified teenager, but like a hardened criminal who posed an immediate threat to the room. My son Marcus was pacing furiously between the bench and Chloe. The boy I had raised, the man whose logistics company I had funded with my own life savings, looked completely unhinged. His expensive cashmere sweater was thrown on inside out. He was running his hands over his face, sighing loudly, making sure everyone in the room knew just how stressed and burdened he was by his own child. He did not look at Aaliyah with concern. He looked at her with pure disgust. I took a breath, preparing to step forward and end this circus, but before my foot could even hit the floor, the unthinkable happened. Marcus stopped his pacing. He turned toward the metal bench, his face twisting with a sudden explosive rage. He closed the distance between himself and his daughter in 2 long strides. He raised his hand, and with a sickening crack that echoed off the concrete walls of the precinct, he backhanded Aaliyah across the face. The sound made my heart stop. The force of the blow snapped her small head to the side. "You are an absolute disgrace," Marcus roared, his voice trembling with furious indignation. "Look at what you have done. Look at your mother. Chloe has done nothing but love you. She has done nothing but try to give you a perfect life, and this is how you repay her. You steal from her. You destroy her property. You are tearing this family apart." I froze, the blood roaring in my ears. Every maternal instinct in my body screamed at me to cross that room, grab my son by the collar of his expensive sweater, and teach him a lesson he would never forget. But the auditor in me clamped down hard on my anger. Anger is loud, and loud makes you careless. I needed to let them play their hands. I needed to see exactly how deep this rot went. Aaliyah did not scream. She did not fight back. She slowly turned her head forward, a bright red mark already blooming across her cheek, contrasting sharply with her deep brown skin. Tears streamed down her face, falling silently onto the collar of her oversized sweatshirt. She looked up at her father with eyes completely hollowed out by betrayal. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely a whisper, broken and completely voiceless. "I did not do it, Dad. Please, I swear I was not in the car. I do not know how her earrings got in my room. Please believe me." "She is lying to your face, Marcus!" Chloe suddenly wailed, pulling the paper bag away from her mouth. She threw her head back, letting out a dramatic, soul-shattering sob that echoed through the entire station. Officer Davis immediately placed a comforting hand on Chloe's shoulder, shooting a look of absolute contempt toward Aaliyah. Chloe sniffled loudly, wiping away non-existent tears from her dry cheeks. "I tried, Marcus. God knows I tried." She looked up at her husband, her voice quivering with expertly crafted sorrow. "I tried to raise her like my own after her mother died. I bought her the best clothes, I put her in the best private school, I tried to show her what a civilized, loving home looks like. But it does not matter what we do, Marcus. You cannot fix what is broken inside her. Her ghetto attitude is just in her blood. She is always going to be just like those people from her mother's side of town." There it was. The poison. The quiet, insidious racism that Chloe had always harbored, finally spoken out loud in a police station where she knew she had the upper hand. She was using coded language, throwing the words ghetto and blood out there to subtly stroke the prejudices of the white officer standing beside her and to manipulate the deep-seated insecurities of her husband. She was entirely weaponizing her tears to erase my granddaughter's humanity. And the most tragic part was that Marcus, a black man, a father who should have known better, simply nodded. He looked at his own flesh and blood like she was a stranger, a burden he could no longer bear. He stepped back from the bench, crossing his arms completely, surrendering his daughter to the system. He had chosen his new wife's performance over his child's reality. I looked closely at Chloe from my vantage point. I noticed the details. If she had been asleep when her car was supposedly crashed into the neighbor's garage, why was she wearing a full face of perfectly blended foundation? If a 17-year-old girl who had never taken a sip of alcohol in her life had just crashed a heavy SUV, why was there no smell of liquor in the air? Why was there no bruise on Aaliyah's collarbone from a seatbelt locking up? Why were her hands completely steady and free of the tiny glass abrasions that come from an airbag deployment? The numbers did not add up. The narrative was a poorly constructed fabrication designed entirely to get Aaliyah out of the house. Officer Davis cleared his throat, his expression hardening as he turned away from Chloe and walked toward the booking desk. He pulled a thick stack of paperwork from the printer, the machine grinding loudly in the quiet room. He grabbed a heavy black pen and walked over to Marcus, his posture rigid with authority. "Mr. Caldwell." Officer Davis said, his tone entirely devoid of the warmth he had just shown Chloe. "We have the stolen jewelry recovered from her bedroom, and the vehicle is being towed to impound. Given her attitude and the severity of the property damage, the magistrate has advised that we not release her on her own recognizance. I have the booking paperwork ready right here. We are going to process her into the County Juvenile Detention Center for the weekend until she can face a judge on Monday morning. I just need you to sign here as her legal guardian to authorize the transfer." Marcus did not hesitate. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not ask to speak to his daughter alone. He reached his hand out to take the pen from the officer, ready to sign Aaliyah's life away, ready to throw her into a system that routinely destroys children who look exactly like her. Aaliyah saw the pen moving toward her father's hand. She squeezed her eyes shut, her head dropping to her chest. She let out a small, heartbreaking whimper. "Grandma," she whispered to the empty room, "please." That was my cue. The observation period was over. The audit had officially begun. I stepped out from the shadows of the bulletin board, the heels of my leather boots clicking sharply rhythmically against the hard linoleum floor. The sound was deliberate, echoing like the ticking of a metronome. I walked straight into the harsh fluorescent light, bringing the temperature of the entire room down to freezing. "Do not sign a single letter on that page, Marcus." The entire room seemed to freeze at the sound of my voice. Marcus spun around his pen, hovering just inches above the booking paperwork. His eyes widened in shock, and for a brief second, the arrogant, exhausted businessman faded away, replaced by the frightened little boy who knew he had just been caught making a terrible mistake. "Mother, what are you doing here?" Marcus demanded, his voice thick with a mixture of embarrassment and defensive anger. "You need to go home. This is family business, and Chloe and I are handling it." I ignored him completely. I did not even grant him the dignity of eye contact. Instead, I walked straight past my son and stopped directly in front of Officer Davis. Up close, the police officer looked much younger than I had initially thought, perhaps no more than 25, easily swayed by the practiced theatrics of a crying blonde woman in a silk robe. He looked down at me, puffing out his chest slightly, clearly annoyed that his rescue mission was being interrupted by an elderly black woman. "Ma, I am going to have to ask you to step back," Officer Davis said, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. "This is an active juvenile processing, and unless you are her legal guardian, you have no business interfering." "I am her grandmother," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of the hysteria he was clearly expecting from me. "And more importantly, Officer, I am the primary financial backer of the corporate estate that owns the vehicle you are currently writing a report about. Now, before my son signs a document that will inevitably lead to a massive civil rights lawsuit against you in this department, I have a very simple question. What was my granddaughter's blood alcohol content when you administered the breathalyzer tonight?" Officer Davis shifted his weight, his confident posture faltering just a fraction of an inch. He glanced nervously over his shoulder at Chloe, who had suddenly stopped her dramatic hyperventilating. "The machine read 0.0, he admitted reluctantly, crossing his arms over his chest. "But that does not mean anything. She was erratic when we arrived on the scene. She was disoriented. We have every reason to believe she is under the influence of narcotics, which we will test for once she is processed into the detention facility. So you have no physical evidence of intoxication," I stated clearly, letting the words hang in the quiet air of the precinct. "You found a terrified teenager violently awoken in her bed, and because her stepmother cried and pointed a finger, you decided she was on drugs and dragged her in here in chains. She stole my earrings!" Chloe suddenly shrieked, stepping out from behind Marcus. "She threw them at me when I caught her trying to sneak back into the house. She is a thief and a junkie, Josephine, and you cannot protect her anymore." I finally turned my gaze to Chloe. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her frantic energy. I simply reached into my oversized leather tote bag and pulled out my tablet. When you spend your entire career as a senior corporate auditor, you learn one fundamental truth about human nature. People will lie to your face without a second thought, but numbers, data, and digital footprints have absolutely no reason to lie. 10 years ago, when Marcus came to me begging for the seed money to start his logistics company, I gave him the funds under one very strict condition. I demanded total unhindered access to the financial and physical tracking of every single corporate asset. Marcus always was a man who loved loopholes, so he registered Chloe's luxury Range Rover as a company fleet vehicle for tax purposes. It was a foolish decision on his part, but tonight it was the greatest gift he could have ever given me. I tapped the screen of my tablet, the bright white glow illuminating my face in the dim police station. I opened the proprietary fleet management software that monitored every truck, van, and leased vehicle under the Caldwell Logistics umbrella. "Officer Davis," I said smoothly, turning the screen so he could see the detailed map and the scrolling columns of data. "I assume Chloe told you that her vehicle was parked safely in her driveway at 2 o'clock this morning and that Aaliyah somehow bypassed the security system, stole the keys, and took it for a joyride." "That is exactly what happened." Chloe snapped, her voice pitching higher, a slight tremor of genuine panic finally bleeding through her fake tears. I tapped a specific row of data on the screen. The map instantly zoomed in, dropping a bright red pin on a location nearly 20 miles away from my son's house. According to the GPS telemetry hardwired into the engine block of the Range Rover, I explained, pointing directly at the glowing red dot, this vehicle was never in your driveway at 2 in the morning. In fact, it was parked in a private VIP lot outside a nightclub called the Neon Lounge in the downtown district. It sat there idling from midnight until exactly 3:15 in the morning. Officer Davis leaned in his brow, furrowing as he read the timestamps and the GPS coordinates flashing across the screen. Marcus stepped forward as well, his mouth opening slightly in confusion. "That app is wrong," Chloe blurted out, taking a sudden step toward me as if she might try to snatch the tablet from my hands. "Those tracking things malfunction all the time. You cannot believe that over my actual testimony. She is trying to manipulate you, officer." I did not flinch. I simply swiped my finger across the screen, moving from the GPS log to the cloud storage interface. "I understand your skepticism." "Officer," I said, maintaining absolute eye contact with the policeman, "GPS can be challenged. So let us take a look at the live dashcam feed. Our corporate policy requires dual-facing cameras in all fleet vehicles for insurance purposes. The footage automatically uploads to a secure server the moment the ignition is turned on." I tapped the video file time-stamped for 3:30 this morning. The video filled the screen crisp and undeniable in high definition. It showed the interior cabin of the Range Rover. The streetlights from the downtown district flashed rhythmically through the windshield, casting bright yellow glows across the face of the driver. It was not a 17-year-old girl behind the wheel. The person driving the car was a 30-year-old white man with a distinctive tribal tattoo creeping up his neck. He was sweating profusely, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. In his right hand, he was holding a small glass pipe, bringing it to his lips and inhaling deeply as he steered the heavy SUV with his left knee. He was laughing to himself, completely out of his mind on whatever narcotic he was smoking. I paused the video right on a clear, undeniable frame of his face. I turned the tablet toward Chloe. "Tell me, Chloe," I asked softly, "does my granddaughter suddenly look remarkably like your older brother, Chad?" The silence that fell over the police station was absolute and suffocating. The only sound in the room was the low, irritating hum of the fluorescent lights above us. I pressed play again. The video continued for another 30 seconds before the driver suddenly jerked the wheel, his eyes widening in panic as he missed a turn. The camera shook violently, the sound of screeching tires and crushing metal echoing tinny but loud through the speakers of my tablet. The airbags deployed in a cloud of white dust, and the driver scrambled desperately out of the vehicle, abandoning it right in the neighbor's brick garage. Marcus stared at the screen, his face draining of all color. He looked from the tablet to his wife, his jaw working but no words coming out. Chloe dropped the brown paper bag onto the floor. It hit the linoleum with a soft rustle. In an instant, the fragile, terrified victim vanished completely. Her breathing leveled out, her shoulders squared, the tears magically dried up. The performance was over, and the cold, calculating woman I had always known she was finally stepped out into the light. She glared at me with a hatred so pure and toxic it practically radiated off her skin. Officer Davis cleared his throat, his face burning a bright shade of crimson. He suddenly looked very young and very foolish. He realized exactly how badly he had been played and the potential liability he had just exposed his department to by arresting a minor without a shred of verified evidence. He did not say a word to Chloe. He turned his back on her, walked briskly over to the metal bench, and pulled a small silver key from his belt. "I am going to take these off you now, Aaliyah," he muttered quietly, avoiding eye contact with my granddaughter. The heavy metallic click of the handcuffs unlocking was the sweetest sound I had heard all night. The thick steel bracelets fell away, and Aaliyah immediately pulled her arms to her chest, rubbing her bruised, swollen wrists. She did not look at her father. She stood up on shaky legs, bypassed Marcus entirely, and threw her arms around my waist, burying her face in my wool coat. I wrapped my arms around her trembling shoulders, holding her tight, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "We are leaving," I announced to the room, my voice final and uncompromising. "Marcus, I suggest you call a very good lawyer for your brother-in-law, and I suggest you never ever let me see you raise your hand to my granddaughter again." Marcus stood frozen in the center of the room, completely shattered by the reality of his own colossal failure. I turned and guided Aaliyah toward the heavy glass doors of the exit, but Chloe was not finished. As I pushed the door open, letting the cold night air sweep into the stifling station, Chloe stepped right into my path. She leaned in close, her designer perfume masking the scent of stale coffee in the room. She was smiling a tight, venomous grin that showed her perfectly white teeth. "You win tonight, old lady," she whispered, her voice so low that only I could hear the pure malice dripping from every syllable. "Enjoy your little victory." Because Marcus already signed the medical proxy papers this afternoon to commit her to a behavioral facility tomorrow. He thinks she is crazy, and he will do whatever I tell him to do. She will be locked away in a ward by noon, and I will be in full legal control of her $5 million trust fund by Friday. You cannot audit your way out of a judge's order. She took a step back, her eyes gleaming with wicked triumph, confident that she still held the ultimate weapon. I looked at her, pulling my coat tighter around Aaliyah. I did not give her the satisfaction of seeing me worry. I simply smiled back a cold, empty smile and walked my granddaughter out into the dark. The sun had barely begun to peek over the tops of the Georgia pines when we pulled into the affluent suburban neighborhood where my son lived. It was exactly 7 o'clock in the morning. The drive from the police precinct to my house and then back to the neighborhood had been entirely silent. Aaliyah sat in the passenger seat of my car, staring blankly out the window. Her small hands were tightly gripping the edges of her oversized sweatshirt. I did not try to force her to speak. Trauma requires space to breathe, and I knew she was still processing the profound betrayal of watching her father hand her over to the system without a second thought. My plan was simple and methodical. We were going to walk inside to pack her clothes and gather her school books. We would leave that toxic environment forever, and I would deal with the legal guardianship papers later today. But as I turned the steering wheel and my car glided onto the smooth concrete of the driveway, my foot slammed instinctively onto the brake pedal. The car jerked to a sudden halt. There, scattered across the perfectly manicured bright green lawn of my son's $500,000 property, were 6 heavy black plastic garbage bags. They had not even bothered to tie them properly. I put the car in park and stepped out into the crisp morning air. My eyes scanned the devastating scene in front of me. The bags were bursting open at the seams, spilling the contents of a 17-year-old girl's life directly onto the wet morning grass. I saw her expensive winter coats shoved carelessly alongside her school notebooks. I saw the thick woven blanket I had brought back for her from my trip to Charleston, now stained with wet mud. I saw her academic awards bent and creased, pushed into a bag of dirty laundry. Most devastating of all, I saw the framed photograph of her late mother lying face down in the dirt with the glass completely shattered. They had not packed her belongings. They had purged them. They had treated her entire existence in that house like a pile of infected waste that needed to be sterilized and removed before the wealthy neighbors woke up. I heard the car door open behind me. Aaliyah stepped out, and her eyes widened as she took in the sight of her life scattered across the lawn. She let out a soft, sharp gasp as her hands flew to her mouth. She did not cry because she was far past crying. The absolute cruelty of the gesture seemed to finally sever whatever fragile string of hope she had left for her father. Before I could even instruct her to get back in the car, the heavy oak front door of the house swung open. Marcus stepped out onto the wide front porch. He was dressed in a tailored suit and held a fresh cup of coffee in his hand. He looked completely rested and unbothered by the events of the previous night. He did not look like a man whose daughter had just spent hours in police custody. He looked like a man who had successfully eliminated a pest problem. I walked slowly up the brick pathway while my leather boots crunched against the stray gravel. I stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and positioned myself squarely between my son and my granddaughter. I asked him what exactly the meaning of this was, and I kept my voice dangerously low and steady. I told him I was bringing her to collect her things, and I did not tell him to throw her memories into the dirt like common garbage. Marcus took a sip of his coffee and looked down at me with a completely unearned sense of authority. He did not even flinch at the sight of the broken glass from his late wife's photograph. He casually stated that he had saved me the trouble. His voice was completely devoid of any parental warmth. He claimed Chloe was exhausted from the ordeal last night, so he had handled it himself. He firmly stated that Aaliyah was not stepping foot inside his house again, and that she had lost all privileges to his property. I crossed my arms over my chest and stared at the stranger wearing my son's face. I told him he did not have the authority to permanently lock her out. She was a minor, and this was her primary residence. I reminded him that he was her legal guardian. Marcus snapped back that I was exactly right. His posture stiffened as he stepped closer to the edge of the porch. He proudly declared that as her legal guardian, he had made the executive decision regarding her care. He told me I thought I had won some great victory last night by getting her out of the precinct, but all I did was prove how deeply delusional and dangerous she really was. He announced he had spent the entire morning on the phone with a facility in upstate New York. It was a highly strict and fully residential therapeutic boarding school for troubled and defiant teenagers. The words hit the air like physical blows. Aaliyah let out a choked sob behind me and grabbed the back of my coat. I reached back and wrapped my hand tightly around hers to steady her. I repeated the words therapeutic boarding school and made sure to enunciate every syllable to highlight the sheer absurdity of his claim. I reminded him that my granddaughter was an honors student who volunteered at the library and had zero disciplinary history. I told him she did not need a lockdown facility in another state. I said she needed a father who did not blindly believe the malicious lies of a woman who had hated her since the day she moved in. Marcus roared at me to not talk about his wife like that. His sudden anger spilled his coffee over the rim of his mug and onto the wooden porch. He yelled that I had absolutely no idea what Chloe had been through and no idea the hell this girl had put her through. He pointed an accusing finger directly at Aaliyah, while his face twisted with a completely fabricated sense of victimhood. He claimed Chloe had bent over backwards to accommodate her, and all Aaliyah did was lie still and manipulate. He asked if I knew how much stress that caused a household, and what that stress was doing to Chloe's health. He stated they had been trying to build a family and had been going through incredibly expensive and painful fertility treatments for the past 6 months. He claimed the doctor explicitly told them Chloe needed a perfectly calm and stress-free environment. I stared at him while my mind immediately categorized and analyzed the information he was volunteering. An auditor knows that money always leaves a trail. Fertility treatments represent an expensive medical procedure that requires massive out-of-pocket payments, constant doctor visits, and immense emotional volatility. It was the perfect cover story. It was the ultimate unassailable excuse Chloe had fed him to explain away the missing funds from his bank accounts and her erratic hostile behavior. A man running a logistics company should notice tens of thousands of dollars leaving his accounts, but Marcus was always blind to the details. Chloe was probably routing the money through dummy invoices while claiming it was going to a clinic. She was not trying to get pregnant at all. She was creating a massive financial black hole and blaming my granddaughter for the emotional toll of her own criminal activities. I quietly told him that his wife was not stressed because of Aaliyah. I locked my eyes onto his with absolute certainty and told him his wife was stressed because she was a liar. I warned him that one day very soon he was going to wake up and realize he had thrown away his only child to protect a woman who was bleeding him completely dry. Marcus laughed with a harsh and humorless sound that echoed across the quiet suburban street. He sneered and shook his head in disgust, telling me I was just as delusional as she was. He claimed I always hated Chloe because she was white and because she did not cower to my constant need for control. He told me that just because I loaned him the money to start his business 10 years ago did not mean I got to dictate how he ran his family. He proudly declared those days were over. He said the papers for the boarding school were already being drawn up by his attorney, and a transport service was going to pick Aaliyah up from my house at noon tomorrow. He threatened that if I tried to hide her, he would have me arrested for kidnapping. He finalized his speech by stating she was his daughter, and she was going to get the psychological help she desperately needed whether I liked it or not. He was completely gone, and the manipulation was absolute. Chloe had found the exact pressure points of his ego, his insecurity, and his blind desperation to maintain the illusion of a perfect, wealthy suburban life. She had convinced him that his own flesh and blood was the enemy, and he had swallowed the poison without a single question. I did not argue with him anymore because there is absolutely no benefit in negotiating with a hostage who has fallen in love with their captor. I simply nodded my head and accepted the parameters of the war he had just officially declared. I told him smoothly that if that was his final decision as the head of his household, then I suggested he go back inside and tend to his fragile wife. I stated we would gather what was left of her things and be off his property in 5 minutes. My voice was completely devoid of the panic he was so desperately hoping to provoke. Marcus looked slightly disappointed that I had not screamed or begged. He opened his mouth to deliver another self-righteous lecture, but the sound of a powerful engine roaring down the quiet street cut him off completely. We all turned our heads toward the noise. A brand new and gleaming black Mercedes sedan turned sharply into the driveway while the tires squealed slightly against the concrete. The car parked aggressively close to my own vehicle, and the engine cut off with a heavy and expensive purr. I stared at the vehicle, and my mind immediately began running the numbers. A car like that retailed for well over $100,000. The doors opened simultaneously. Stepping out of the driver's side was Hunter, the father of Chloe. He was a man who had declared bankruptcy twice in the last decade, yet he was wearing his usual uniform of a tailored golf shirt and khaki slacks. His face was flushed with an arrogant and unearned confidence. Stepping out of the passenger side looking completely refreshed and utterly untouched by the fact that he had crashed a stolen vehicle into a garage just a few hours prior was Chloe's brother Chad. He was a man who did not even have a legal address yet. Here he was stepping out of a luxury vehicle that still had the temporary dealer plates taped to the windshield. They looked at the garbage bags scattered across the lawn. They looked at Aaliyah trembling behind me. Then they looked at each other and broke into loud and booming laughter. It was a cruel and mocking sound that hung heavy and toxic in the morning air. Hunter adjusted the collar of his expensive but slightly outdated polo shirt as he stepped away from the gleaming black Mercedes. He did not look at me, and he certainly did not look at my granddaughter. Instead, he fixed his gaze on the black plastic garbage bags scattered across the wet grass of the front lawn. A look of profound disgust wrinkled his features, as if he had just stepped in something vile. He walked slowly up the driveway, his leather loafers clicking against the concrete, until he was standing shoulder to shoulder with my son Marcus. Hunter crossed his arms over his chest and let out a loud, patronizing sigh. He told Marcus that it was about time he learned how to discipline properly. His voice was loud enough for the entire street to hear dripping with a sickening blend of fake sympathy and absolute superiority. He patted Marcus on the shoulder and said that a man has to protect his castle. He looked directly at Aaliyah then, and his eyes narrowed with naked prejudice. He stated very clearly that they simply could not let the urban element ruin a good neighborhood. He said property values were fragile and that Chloe had been far too generous, opening her beautiful home to someone who clearly lacked the genetic capacity for gratitude. The words hung in the cold morning air. Urban element. Genetic capacity. It was not even coded language anymore. It was a direct, unapologetic racial attack delivered right on the front porch of a house paid for by my son. And my son, the man I had raised to be proud and strong, did absolutely nothing. Marcus simply nodded his head, looking down at his coffee mug, as if he were a scolded employee agreeing with his boss. He muttered that he was handling it, and that the transport van would be here tomorrow to take her away. While Hunter stroked his own ego, I watched his son Chad lean casually against the passenger side door of the Mercedes. Chad was still wearing the same clothes from the dashcam video. His eyes were half closed, and a lazy, arrogant smirk was plastered across his face. He knew exactly what he had done. He knew that he had been high out of his mind driving his sister into crippling debt and crashing a luxury vehicle into a brick wall. And he knew that my 17-year-old granddaughter had just spent the night in a concrete cell to cover his tracks. Chad caught Aaliyah looking at him. He did not look away in shame. Instead, he tilted his head back and let out a soft, mocking chuckle. He raised his right hand, the same hand that had been holding a glass pipe just hours ago, and gave her a small, sarcastic wave. He was reveling in his immunity. He felt completely untouchable because his sister had successfully manipulated a wealthy black man into destroying his own child to protect a worthless white criminal. I felt Aaliyah stiffen beside me. Her breathing grew rapid and shallow as panic began to bubble up in her chest again. She was looking at the men who had stolen her life and the father who had held the door open for them. I did not scream. I did not curse at Hunter or demand an explanation from Chad. Engaging with them would mean stepping onto their battlefield and playing by their rules. I am an auditor, and I do not argue with the subjects of an investigation. I simply gather the evidence and prepare the final report. I turned my back on the men on the porch. I placed a gentle hand on my granddaughter's shoulder and told her to help me load the car. We worked in total silence. I bent down and picked up the heavy black bags one by one. I ignored the mud staining the cuffs of my tailored coat. I ignored the mocking laughter coming from Chad. I carefully placed the bags into the spacious trunk of my car, making sure nothing else would fall or break. Aaliyah picked up the shattered frame of her mother's photograph, clutching it tightly against her chest as she climbed into the passenger seat and locked the door. I closed the trunk with a firm, heavy thud that echoed down the driveway. I wiped the dirt from my hands using a small handkerchief from my pocket. Then I turned and walked slowly back toward the porch, stopping just a few feet away from where Marcus and Hunter were standing. Hunter puffed out his chest, expecting a fight. Marcus took a step back, looking nervous. I did not look at Hunter. I kept my eyes entirely focused on my son. I made sure my voice was completely devoid of anger, leaving only a chilling professional calm. I told Marcus to keep the house. I said he could keep the manicured lawn and the expensive furniture and the lies he was choosing to swallow. But I told him he needed to remember one very important detail. I lowered my voice, forcing him to lean in slightly to hear me. I reminded him that my name was still listed as the primary guarantor on the mezzanine loan for his logistics company. I told him that without my continued financial backing, that loan could be called in by the bank within 30 days. I looked deep into his eyes and told him to sleep well. The blood instantly drained from my son's face. His jaw went slack and the coffee mug in his hand trembled slightly. He knew exactly what a mezzanine loan was. It was the financial lifeline that kept his entire corporate operation afloat. If I pulled my support, his company would face immediate liquidation. Hunter looked confused, glancing between Marcus and me, not fully understanding the financial guillotine I had just suspended over his son-in-law's neck. Before either of them could speak, I turned around, walked to my car, and drove away, leaving them standing on the pristine lawn with the crushing weight of their own arrogance. The drive to my house was quiet, but the tension in the air was different now. It was no longer the suffocating panic of the police station. It was the quiet exhaustion of a battle just barely survived. I navigated the familiar streets of Atlanta, moving away from the sterile subdivisions and into my own historic neighborhood. My house was a solid brick structure surrounded by massive oak trees that had stood for 100 years. It was a place of deep roots and unbreakable peace. I pulled into the garage and led Aaliyah inside. The moment the heavy wooden front door clicked shut behind us, locking the chaos of the world outside, the atmosphere shifted. The house smelled faintly of vanilla and old paper. It was safe. It was hers. Aaliyah dropped the shattered picture frame onto the entryway table. She took 3 steps into the living room, and then her legs simply gave out. She collapsed onto the thick woven rug, her knees hitting the floor with a heavy thud. The dam that had been holding back her terror and heartbreak finally broke. She began to weep. It was not the quiet, breathless sobbing from the police station. It was a loud, agonizing wail that tore from the very bottom of her soul. She cried for the mother she had lost. She cried for the father who had looked her in the eyes and called her a disgrace. She cried for the sheer, terrifying injustice of being a young black girl in a world where a blonde woman's fake tears could instantly strip away her freedom. I did not tell her to hush. I did not tell her to be strong. I got down on the floor next to her regardless of my bad knees, and I pulled her into my arms. I rocked her back and forth, letting her soak the shoulder of my coat with her tears. I hummed a low, steady melody that my own grandmother used to sing to me until the violent shaking in her shoulders began to subside. After a long time, she pulled back, wiping her swollen eyes with the sleeves of her sweatshirt. I handed her a tissue and told her I was going to make some hot peppermint tea. I told her she was safe now and that no transport van was ever going to come near my property. She took a deep, ragged breath and looked up at me. Her eyes were red and exhausted, but there was a sudden sharp clarity in them. She told me she knew why Chloe did it. I paused halfway to the kitchen, turning back to look at her. I asked her to explain what she meant. Aaliyah swallowed hard, her hands twisting the damp tissue in her lap. She said it was never about the diamond earrings or the car. She explained that she had not been asleep when Chloe claimed the car was stolen. She had been awake in her bedroom studying for an advanced placement history exam. She said she had gone downstairs to get a glass of water right around midnight. She looked at me and her voice dropped to a terrified whisper. She said she walked past the home office. The door was cracked open just an inch. Chloe was inside and Chad was with her. Aaliyah said she heard Chad crying and begging his sister for help. Chad told Chloe that the bookies from downtown were going to break his legs if he did not pay them the $500,000 he owed them by the end of the month. I stood perfectly still, my mind immediately connecting the dots. I asked Aaliyah what Chloe said in response. Aaliyah took another deep breath. She said Chloe told Chad to stop crying. Chloe told him she had already figured it out. Aaliyah peered through the crack in the door and saw Chloe sitting at my son's heavy mahogany desk. Chloe had my son's corporate laptop open. Aaliyah said she watched Chloe use a digital recording on her phone, a software program that perfectly mimicked my son's voice to bypass the voice authorization on the bank security hotline. She said she saw Chloe using a digital pad to trace my son's exact signature onto a wire transfer authorization form. Aaliyah looked down at her hands. She said she gasped out loud when she saw it. Chloe heard the noise and whipped her head around, catching Aaliyah's eye through the crack in the door. Aaliyah said she ran back upstairs and locked herself in her room, terrified. 2 hours later, the police were breaking down her bedroom door, dragging her out of bed for a crime she did not commit. I stood in the hallway, letting the absolute magnitude of the revelation wash over me. Chloe had not just framed a child to get her out of the house. Chloe had framed a child to eliminate the only witness to a massive federal financial crime. I did not go to the kitchen to make the tea. I turned around and walked directly into my own home office. I sat down at my vintage oak desk and opened the lid of my secure laptop. I reached into the top drawer and pulled out my reading glasses, sliding them onto my face. I looked at the dark screen as it powered on. They thought they could steal from my family and use my granddaughter as a scapegoat to cover their tracks. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They had picked a fight with the wrong auditor. The hot peppermint tea steamed gently in the ceramic mug as I handed it to my granddaughter. Her hands were still shaking slightly, but the sheer terror that had gripped her in the police station was finally beginning to recede. We sat together in this quiet sanctuary of my living room while the morning light filtered gently through the thick velvet curtains. I asked her to take her time. I told her that nobody was going to interrupt us and that I needed to know exactly what she saw and heard in that house. Aaliyah took a slow sip of the tea and let out a long, trembling breath. She looked down at the dark liquid in her mug as if she were trying to gather the courage to relive a nightmare. She told me it started around midnight. She had been sitting at the small desk in her bedroom trying to memorize dates and treaties for an upcoming advanced placement history exam. The house was completely silent. Marcus had gone to bed early, complaining of a migraine, and Chloe had claimed she was going to take a long bath and read a magazine. Aaliyah said she felt a sudden wave of exhaustion and decided to go down to the kitchen to get a glass of cold water to help her stay awake. She walked softly down the carpeted stairs, making sure not to wake her father. But as she reached the bottom landing, she noticed something strange. A thin slice of bright yellow light was spilling out from beneath the heavy mahogany door of the home office. She knew her father was upstairs fast asleep, and Chloe rarely ever went into the office unless she wanted to complain about the internet signal. Aaliyah crept closer to the door, her bare feet making absolutely no sound on the hardwood floor of the hallway. As she approached, she heard voices. They were low and hurried, filled with a frantic energy that immediately made her stomach knot with anxiety. She recognized the first voice right away. It was Chad. Aaliyah said she was completely confused because Chad did not live with them, and she had not heard the front door open or the doorbell ring. He must have used the spare key Chloe kept hidden in the garage. Chad was not speaking in his usual arrogant drawl. He was pleading. His voice was cracking with genuine raw panic. Aaliyah leaned closer to the door, pressing her ear against the cool wood. She heard Chad begging his sister for help. He was pacing back and forth, his footsteps heavy and erratic. He told Chloe that he was completely out of time. He said the bookies from the downtown syndicate were no longer accepting his excuses or his partial payments. They had cornered him in the parking lot of a nightclub earlier that night and showed him a weapon. Chad told his sister that he owed them exactly $500,000, and if he did not wire the money into their offshore account by the end of the week, they were going to put him in the hospital, or worse. Aaliyah said, her breath caught in her throat. $500,000 was a staggering amount of money even for a wealthy family. She expected Chloe to gasp, to yell at her brother, to tell him to go to the police. But Chloe did not sound surprised at all. In fact, Aaliyah said Chloe sounded completely irritated, like a mother dealing with a toddler who had spilled juice on a clean floor. Chloe told him to lower his voice and stop whining. She told Chad that she was already handling his mess, just like she was handling their father's disastrous investments. Aaliyah listened in absolute shock as Chloe casually admitted that Hunter, their father, was completely broke and secretly drowning in debt. Chloe said she had been funneling cash to Hunter for months to keep his luxury lifestyle afloat so none of his country club friends would know he was a total fraud. Chad started crying and asked her where she was going to get another $500,000 so quickly. He asked if Marcus would notice that much money missing. That was when Chloe laughed. Aaliyah said it was the coldest, most terrifying sound she had ever heard. It was not the high-pitched, delicate giggle Chloe used when she was trying to charm my son. It was a dark, calculated, and deeply arrogant laugh. Chloe told Chad that Marcus was a fool who only looked at the bottom line on the quarterly summaries and never bothered to check the individual vendor invoices. She said she had Marcus wrapped so tightly around her finger that he would believe the sky was green if she cried hard enough while saying it. Aaliyah felt sick to her stomach, but she could not pull herself away from the door. She reached out and pushed the heavy wood just a fraction of an inch, creating a tiny crack so she could see inside the room. The sight that met her eyes was straight out of a psychological thriller. Chloe was sitting in my son's expensive leather chair, positioned behind the large mahogany desk. Only the green glow of the desk lamp illuminated her face, casting deep shadows that made her look sharp and menacing. My son's corporate laptop was open in front of her. Next to the laptop was a digital signature pad, the kind delivery drivers use to capture signatures. But Chloe was not signing for a package. She was holding a stylus and carefully tracing over a piece of tracing paper that had my son's signature printed on it. Aaliyah watched as Chloe perfectly replicated Marcus's signature on the digital pad. Then Chloe opened a secure banking portal on the screen. Chad was standing over her shoulder, biting his fingernails nervously. He asked her how she was going to bypass the phone authorization for a transfer that large. He reminded her that the corporate bank required a verbal confirmation from the account holder for any wire transfer exceeding $100,000. Chloe smiled a thin, wicked smile. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her smartphone. She opened an application that Aaliyah had never seen before. Chloe told her brother that technology was a beautiful thing. She explained that she had spent the last 3 weeks secretly recording Marcus while he was on business calls and talking around the house. She had taken hours of his voice and fed it into a highly advanced artificial intelligence voice generator. Aaliyah said she felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead. She watched in pure horror as Chloe typed a sentence into the app on her phone. She pressed a button on the screen. Suddenly, my son's voice filled the room. It sounded exactly like Marcus. The cadence, the tone, the slight southern drawl on the vowels, everything was flawless. The digital voice of my son clearly and confidently authorized a wire transfer to a dummy corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. Aaliyah said the voice was so perfect that for a split second she actually looked around the hallway, expecting to see her father standing there. Chloe played the audio clip again, laughing, as Chad stared at the phone in awe. She told her brother that she was going to call the automated banking system, enter the account numbers, and play the audio file right into the receiver. The bank's voice recognition software would accept it without question, and the money would vanish from the logistics company operating fund long before morning. Aaliyah realized she was witnessing a massive federal crime. She realized the woman who had moved into her home was not just a manipulative stepmother, but a highly organized corporate thief who was systematically destroying her father's entire livelihood. The sheer weight of the discovery was too much for a 17-year-old girl to handle. Aaliyah took a step backward, wanting to run upstairs and lock her door. But as she shifted her weight, her bare heel pressed down on a loose floorboard in the hallway. A sharp, loud creak echoed through the quiet house. Inside the office, the laughter stopped instantly. Aaliyah froze, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. She looked through the crack in the door one last time. Chloe's head had snapped up. Her eyes, completely devoid of any human warmth, locked directly onto the crack in the door. For one terrifying second, Aaliyah and her stepmother stared right at each other. Chloe knew. She knew that Aaliyah had seen the signature pad, the laptop, and the voice generator. She knew that her entire criminal enterprise was suddenly entirely dependent on the silence of a teenager she had spent months tormenting. Aaliyah did not wait to see what Chloe would do next. She turned and ran silently up the stairs, flying into her bedroom and locking the door behind her. She crawled under her blankets, shaking uncontrollably, praying that Chloe would not come upstairs. She lay there in the dark for what felt like hours. She heard the faint sound of the front door opening and closing as Chad sneaked out into the night. She heard Chloe's soft footsteps moving down the hallway, pausing right outside Aaliyah's bedroom door. Aaliyah held her breath, waiting for the knob to turn, but it never did. Chloe walked away and returned to the master bedroom. Aaliyah thought she was safe. She thought she would have until morning to figure out how to tell her father what she had seen, but she had underestimated the absolute ruthlessness of the woman she was dealing with. Chloe was not going to give Aaliyah the chance to speak. Chloe needed a distraction so massive and so destructive that no one would ever believe a word Aaliyah said. 2 hours later, the police were pounding on the front door. Chloe had staged the theft of the earrings, forced Chad to crash the car, and blamed the entire catastrophe on my granddaughter, knowing Marcus would immediately throw Aaliyah to the wolves to protect his precious wife. Aaliyah finished her story and took a final sip of her tea. She set the mug down on the coffee table and looked at me with exhausted, tear-filled eyes. She told me she was sorry. She said she should have run straight into her father's room and woken him up, but she was just so scared. She said Chloe looked like she wanted to kill her. I sat on the sofa, letting the complete picture of the fraud form in my mind. The pieces all fit together with terrifying precision. The fake fertility treatments to explain missing funds, the sudden push to get Aaliyah sent away to a locked facility, the desperate late-night frame-up. Chloe was not just greedy. She was incredibly desperate and running out of time. I did not feel fear, and I certainly did not feel sorry for my son. I felt a deep, powerful sense of absolute clarity. The chaotic emotional drama of the police station and the front lawn faded away completely, replaced by the cold, hard logic of a financial audit. I stood up from the sofa and smoothed the wrinkles from my wool trousers. I walked over to the corner of the living room where my vintage oak desk sat, bathed in the morning light. I reached out and opened the heavy lid of my secure laptop. I opened the top drawer and pulled out my silver reading glasses, sliding them carefully onto my face. The screen flared to life, illuminating the dark, polished wood of the desk. I looked over my shoulder at my granddaughter. They picked a fight with the wrong auditor. The house was completely silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. Aaliyah was finally asleep upstairs, exhausted from the sheer terror of the night before. I sat alone in my home office, surrounded by walls lined with heavy law books and financial ledgers from a lifetime of auditing. The morning sun was climbing higher, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany of my desk. I stared at the blank screen of my secure laptop, taking a moment to center myself. When you audit a stranger, it is simply a matter of mathematics and legal boundaries. But when you are about to audit your own flesh and blood, you have to build a wall around your heart. You have to shut down every maternal instinct and operate with the cold, ruthless efficiency of a surgeon removing a tumor. 10 years ago, my son Marcus sat in this exact room, begging me to finance his dream. He had a brilliant mind for logistics, but he had absolutely no credit and no capital. I wrote him a check for $2 million to buy his first fleet of freight trucks, but I did not give him that money blindly. I demanded a master administrative key to his entire corporate server network. I had my own technology specialist install a hidden backdoor access portal that bypassed all front-end security measures. Marcus could never delete it, and he could never alter my permissions. I had not used that access in over 3 years. I wanted to believe he had grown into a responsible corporate officer. But as I typed in my decryption password, I knew that trust had been a catastrophic mistake. The screen flared to life, and I bypassed the polished dashboard that displayed the company summaries. Those reports were nothing but colorful lies designed by accountants to keep executives comfortable. I dove straight into the raw, unedited general ledger. I pulled up the operating accounts, the payroll reserves, and the accounts payable modules. At a superficial glance, the numbers appeared stable. The balances showed adequate liquidity to cover the next quarter. But fraud is a highly intelligent parasite. It perfectly mimics the host, masking its destruction until the host collapses entirely. You do not find fraud by looking at the big picture. You find it by looking for the tiny, irregular heartbeats in the daily transactions. I started with the vendor invoices. A company like Caldwell Logistics has massive daily overhead. They pay hundreds of independent truck drivers, maintenance shops, fuel suppliers, and warehouse leases. It is the absolute perfect environment to hide stolen money because the volume of transactions provides a natural camouflage. I wrote a quick sorting script and ran a duplicate payment query targeting any outgoing wire transfers that fell just below the standard $100,000 banking flag limit. The system hummed for a moment before spitting out a list of anomalies. That was when I found the first dummy invoice. It was a payment for $98,000 dispersed to a company named Apex Fleet Consulting. I opened the digital invoice file, and my auditor instincts immediately screamed. The document was amateurish. It had no tax identification number, no physical corporate address, and the billing contact was a generic email server. The services rendered were listed simply as quarterly strategic advising. It was a phantom company. I grabbed my notepad and began tracking the routing numbers attached to that specific payment. The funds did not go to a domestic commercial bank where they could be easily frozen or audited by federal authorities. Instead, they were swept into an intermediate holding account at a small regional bank. From there, the money was immediately spliced into 5 smaller wire transfers and pushed through an offshore routing network. I tracked the digital fingerprints of those transactions directly to a corporate registry in the Cayman Islands. The beneficiary of that shell company was a registered agent firm, but a quick search of the firm incorporation documents revealed a secondary authorized signer. The last name of that signer was the exact same maiden name as my daughter-in-law. Chloe was not just a manipulative stepmother crying fake tears in a police station. She was operating a highly sophisticated embezzlement ring right under my son's nose. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk as the adrenaline began to flood my system. Aaliyah had told me that she heard Chad begging for $500,000 to pay off illegal bookies. Aaliyah believed that was the extent of the theft. But a teenager does not understand the bottomless pit of corporate greed. You do not set up offshore shell companies and intermediate holding accounts just to pay off a single gambling debt. You build an infrastructure like this when you are planning to drain the entire ocean. I initiated a comprehensive historical audit. I instructed the software to flag every single transaction routed to that specific offshore network over the previous 18 months. I also cross-referenced the dates of those transfers with the digital authorization logs from the bank. The bank required voice authorization for large transfers, and I could see the exact timestamps where Chloe had used the artificial intelligence voice generator to mimic Marcus. The logs showed her calling the automated system late at night when Marcus was asleep, perfectly bypassing the security protocols. I watched the progress bar on my screen as the software processed the massive volume of data. Thousands of transactions were analyzed, categorized, and tallied. When the final sum finally populated at the bottom of the screen, the number was so staggering that the breath completely left my lungs. Chloe had not stolen $500,000. She had systematically and ruthlessly drained $2.5 million out of Caldwell Logistics. I clicked through the deeper financial health indicators, and the reality of the situation turned my blood to ice. To cover the massive gaps in the cash flow, Chloe had been quietly liquidating the company emergency reserves. When those ran dry, she had taken out predatory merchant cash advances against future freight receivables, tying up the company future income in high-interest debt. Worst of all, she had completely stopped paying the corporate payroll taxes to the federal government for 3 consecutive quarters. Caldwell Logistics was not just struggling, it was a hollowed-out carcass, teetering on the absolute brink of total insolvency. In less than 2 weeks, the payroll checks for over 200 hardworking truck drivers and warehouse staff were going to bounce. The merchant lenders would immediately call in their loans, seizing the physical trucks and the warehouse properties. The tax agencies would freeze whatever accounts were left to recover the unpaid taxes. Marcus was not just going to lose his business. He was going to face federal bankruptcy, complete public ruin, and potentially criminal negligence charges for failing to secure his own corporate accounts. Chloe had eaten his life from the inside out. She had stolen his money, ruined his company, and last night she had attempted to throw his only daughter into the juvenile justice system just to buy herself a few more days to finish looting the vault. She was likely planning to wire the last remaining funds, pack her designer bags, and vanish, leaving Marcus to take the fall for the entire collapse. I did not panic. Panic is a useless emotion that only benefits the enemy. I reached into the locked drawer of my desk and pulled out a military-grade encrypted flash drive. I plugged it into the side of my laptop and began mass downloading everything. I pulled the raw ledger data, the forged authorization logs, the dummy invoices, the offshore routing confirmation numbers, and the Internet Protocol address histories that proved the transfers were initiated from the computer at their home. Every single piece of undeniable digital evidence I needed to put my daughter-in-law in a federal penitentiary was flowing directly onto that drive. I watched the green progress bar slowly inch its way across the screen. 90%, 95%, 99%. I felt a cold, absolute sense of victory settling over me. They thought I was just a retired grandmother who could be pushed aside and intimidated by their country club arrogance. They had no idea they had just handed a loaded weapon to the one person in the family who knew exactly how to pull the trigger. The screen flashed a bright green, confirming the secure download was complete. I reached out to pull the drive from the port, but before my fingers could even touch the metal, a sudden, incredibly loud knock echoed through the quiet house. It was not a polite, neighborly tap. It was heavy, authoritative, and demanding, rattling the frosted glass of the front door. I froze my hand, hovering over the laptop. I carefully pulled the encrypted drive from the machine, slipped it deep into the pocket of my wool trousers, and closed the laptop lid. I walked out of the home office and moved silently down the hallway. I pulled open the heavy wooden front door expecting to see Marcus, or perhaps Hunter, coming to make more threats. But standing on my front porch was a complete stranger. He was a tall man wearing a cheap gray suit and holding a thick yellow manila envelope. He looked at me with a completely bored expression. He asked if I was Josephine Caldwell. I kept my posture perfectly straight and told him that I was. The man abruptly thrust the heavy envelope into my hands. He did not say another word. He simply turned around, walked down the porch steps, and got into an unmarked vehicle parked on the street. I stood in the doorway, the cool morning breeze rustling the leaves on the lawn. I looked down at the thick envelope resting in my hands. Printed directly across the top in bold, aggressive black ink were the words "Legal Summons" and "Petition for Emergency Guardianship." I closed the heavy wooden front door and stood completely still in the quiet hallway of my home. The thick manila envelope felt unusually heavy in my hands. The court server had vanished down the street, leaving behind a profound and chilling silence. I walked slowly back into my home office, my leather boots making soft sounds against the hardwood floor. I sat down in my large vintage chair and placed the envelope directly in the center of my polished mahogany desk. I did not tear it open in a frantic panic. I reached for my silver letter opener and sliced the top edge with careful, deliberate precision. I pulled out a thick stack of crisp white legal papers. The bold black letters printed across the top of the very first page read, "Petition for Emergency Medical Guardianship and Motion for Immediate Removal of Fiduciary Duties." The official petitioner was listed as my son Marcus. But as I began to read the dense legal paragraphs, the venom dripping from every single sentence had my daughter-in-law written completely over it. I put my reading glasses back on and read through the 30-page document line by line. According to the sworn affidavits attached to the petition, I was suffering from severe and rapid cognitive decline. They formally claimed I was exhibiting the advanced symptoms of early-onset dementia. They stated in legally binding documents that I was prone to sudden bouts of paranoia, dangerous hallucinations, and highly erratic behavior. Chloe had gone so far as to include fabricated journal entries claiming she had witnessed me leaving the gas stove burning for hours, wandering around my front yard in the middle of the night, and forgetting the names of my own relatives. They even weaponized my actions at the police station the night before. The petition claimed I had stormed into a law enforcement facility, making wild, delusional accusations against my own family to protect a troubled teenager. They twisted my rescue of Aaliyah into an act of complete mental instability. I turned to the financial section of the petition, and the true motive finally revealed itself completely. This was not about my physical health, and it was certainly not about my mental capacity. This was about Aaliyah and the massive financial fortress I had built to protect her. When Aaliyah's mother passed away, she left behind a modest life insurance policy and a small portfolio of technology stocks. Her mother had worked tirelessly her entire life, wanting nothing more than to ensure her daughter would never have to depend on a man for her survival. Over the past 10 years, I had taken that initial seed money and personally managed the portfolio. I used every ounce of my auditing and investment experience to grow it into an ironclad trust fund valued at over $5 million. As the sole legal executor of the trust, I was bound by the law to hand over full unrestricted control of those assets to Aaliyah on the exact day she turned 18. Her 18th birthday was exactly 2 weeks away. The auditor in my mind immediately connected the final pieces of the puzzle. Chloe had stolen $2.5 million from the logistics company. She knew the quarterly financial reports were due at the end of the month. She knew the commercial lenders were going to start calling about the missed merchant cash advance payments, and she knew my son would inevitably panic when the corporate accounts ran dry. She needed a massive influx of completely untraceable cash immediately. She needed to either replace the money she stole before Marcus noticed the discrepancy, or she needed to completely drain the trust and flee the country with a massive payday. The $5 million trust fund was sitting right there like a golden parachute waiting to be deployed. But I was the only person standing in her way. So she manipulated Marcus into filing a petition to have me declared legally incompetent. If she succeeded, the probate court would immediately strip me of my executor status and appoint Marcus as the new trustee. And since Marcus signed absolutely anything Chloe put in front of him without reading it, she would have absolute unchecked access to my granddaughter's inheritance by the end of the week. She was attempting to use the American legal system to commit the perfect financial execution. Most grandmothers would have dissolved into tears. Most mothers would have called their sons screaming, demanding an explanation for such a profound betrayal. I did not do either of those things. I simply picked up my cell phone and dialed the direct line to my lead legal counsel, Maxwell. Maxwell was a brilliant and utterly ruthless corporate litigator who had handled my financial estate for over 20 years. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and professional. I told him that I had just been served with an emergency guardianship petition. I read him the docket number and outlined the specific medical claims they were making regarding my mental capacity. I could hear Maxwell aggressively typing on his computer keyboard, pulling up the court filings in real time. When he finished reading the digital document, his voice was tight with genuine professional outrage. He told me the petition was entirely frivolous and built on easily disprovable lies. He said he would draft an immediate motion to file a massive countersuit for defamation, and have my personal physician submit a comprehensive neurological evaluation to the judge by tomorrow morning. He promised me he would utterly destroy my son and his wife in open court and make them pay my legal fees for the insult. I listened to my lawyer outline his highly aggressive defense strategy, and then I calmly told him to stop. I explicitly instructed Maxwell not to file a motion to dismiss. I told him not to submit my medical records to the court, and I forbade him from contacting my physician. I ordered him to offer only the weakest possible legal resistance to the initial court inquiries. Maxwell went completely silent on the other end of the line. The sound of his typing stopped entirely. After a long pause, he asked me if I truly understood the severity of what they were trying to do. He warned me that if we did not fight back immediately with overwhelming medical evidence, a judge might actually grant a temporary injunction and freeze my executor powers, leaving the trust vulnerable. I explained my reasoning to Maxwell with the absolute precision of a master chess player setting up a board. I told him that Chloe was a desperate animal backed into a dark financial corner. If we crushed her guardianship petition right now, she would immediately realize we were onto her. She might panic and destroy the digital evidence of her embezzlement. She might take whatever cash she had left from the logistics company and run before the federal authorities could build their criminal case against her. I needed her to stay exactly where she was. I needed her to feel completely secure and entirely overconfident. I told Maxwell that arrogance is the most blinding drug in the world. If we made Chloe believe her legal strategy was actually working, she would let her guard down completely. She would walk right into the devastating trap I was building for her. Maxwell let out a low, appreciative chuckle that rumbled through the phone. He said he understood my strategy completely. He agreed to file a standard delay motion, claiming we simply needed more time to review the documents, which would make it look to Chloe like we were scrambling, weak, and disorganized. He told me to be incredibly careful because playing a desperate woman's game was inherently dangerous. I thanked him, told him I would call him later in the week to finalize the real attack, and ended the connection. I set my phone down on the desk and picked up the thick manila envelope again. I knew the legal petition was only the very first wave of her attack. Chloe was a creature of social warfare. She knew that to convince a probate judge of my sudden mental decline, she first needed to convince the community. She needed witnesses who would testify that my behavior had become erratic and tragic. The absolute confirmation of her secondary strategy arrived less than 3 hours later. My home telephone began to ring. It was not my son calling to apologize. It was Eleanor, a woman I had known for 30 years from our local community center. She sounded hesitant and deeply uncomfortable over the line. She asked me how I was feeling, her voice dripping with an unnatural pity. She mentioned that she had just run into Chloe at the upscale grocery store downtown. Eleanor said Chloe had been crying uncontrollably in the produce aisle, telling everyone who would listen about the terrible tragedy striking our family. I listened silently as Eleanor relayed the gossip. Chloe was apparently going directly from the grocery store to the country club and straight through the phone tree of our church congregation. She was planting poisonous little seeds everywhere she went. She was telling my oldest friends that I was wandering around my house at night talking to people who were not there. She was claiming that I was hoarding garbage and forgetting the names of my own family members. She was painting a tragic, heartbreaking portrait of an old woman losing her grip on reality. She was actively pleading with the community to pray for me while she bravely and selflessly stepped up to save my granddaughter from my supposed delusions. The whispers had officially started, and the community was already beginning to look at me not as a respected professional, but as a tragic burden who needed to be handled. Sunday morning in our community is not just a religious obligation. It is a deeply rooted cultural institution. It is the place where reputations are forged and where family standing is weighed and measured by the congregation. The sanctuary of Mount Zion Baptist Church was filled with the familiar scents of peppermints, rich perfumes, and old polished wood. The choir was already swaying in the loft, their voices filling the high vaulted ceilings with a powerful hymn of deliverance. Normally, this was my sanctuary. This was the place where I found absolute peace after a long week of crunching numbers and auditing ledgers. But this Sunday, I knew the sanctuary was going to be turned into a battlefield. I had told Aaliyah to stay home and lock the doors. She was still too fragile to face the public execution I knew was coming. I sat alone in my usual pew near the center aisle wearing my best tailored navy blue suit, my posture perfectly straight. I was ready for them. I did not have to wait long. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the sanctuary opened, and my son Marcus walked in. But it was the woman clinging tightly to his arm that drew the attention of every single elder and usher in the vestibule. Chloe had dressed perfectly for the role she was about to play. Gone were her usual designer silk dresses and expensive stilettos. Today she wore a plain gray cardigan, buttoned all the way up over a modest dark skirt. She had deliberately applied her makeup to make her face look drawn and exhausted. Dark circles were heavily powdered under her eyes, and she kept her head bowed slightly, as if the sheer weight of her family tragedies was physically pushing her toward the floor. She leaned heavily against Marcus, who looked deeply uncomfortable, but fiercely protective of his supposedly fragile wife. As they moved down the aisle, Chloe did not head straight for a family pew. She stopped right at the row where Mother Jenkins and the senior church elders were sitting. These were the women who controlled the social currency of the entire congregation. What they believed became the absolute truth of the community. Chloe knelt down slightly, placing a trembling hand over her heart as she began to speak to Mother Jenkins. It was a masterpiece of social manipulation. She employed what I call the loud whisper. It is a tone of voice specifically designed to sound intensely private while being perfectly pitched to carry across 3 rows of wooden pews. I sat just 2 rows ahead of them, and I could hear every single venomous word. Chloe sniffled dramatically and told Mother Jenkins how grateful she was for the prayers of the church. She claimed it had been the most terrifying week of her life. She leaned in closer and whispered that my granddaughter Aaliyah had fallen in with a terrible crowd and was spiraling into deep substance abuse. But the truly devastating part, she said, her voice cracking with fake sorrow, was that I was actively enabling the child. Chloe wiped a dry eye and told the elders that my mind was slipping rapidly. She said I had become aggressive, confused, and completely detached from reality. She claimed I had stormed into a police station hallucinating and screaming at the officers, and that Marcus was being forced to take legal action just to protect me from myself. The reaction from the church elders was immediate and entirely predictable. In our community, there is a deep-seated respect for the hierarchy of the family, and unfortunately, a lingering traditional belief that the man of the house should be left to manage his own affairs without interference. Within 10 minutes, the poisonous seeds Chloe had planted began to sprout across the sanctuary. The choir finished their opening hymn, and the congregation stood up for the passing of the peace. This is normally a time of warm hugs, joyful greetings, and the reaffirmation of our shared bonds. But today, as the women of the church approached my pew, their eyes were filled with a sickening mixture of pity and condescending judgment. It was a painful reminder of how easily truth can be distorted by a convincing performance and a few well-placed tears. Sister Beatrice, a woman I had served on the finance committee with for 15 years, walked over to me and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. She looked at me as if I were a lost child whose mind had completely deteriorated. She tilted her head and lowered her voice, telling me that she was praying fiercely for my cognitive health. She told me that getting older was a difficult journey and that I needed to stop fighting my son. She said Marcus was a good, strong man who was carrying a heavy burden and that I needed to step back, let go of my pride, and let him handle his own household. She spoke to me with a slow, exaggerated tone, as if she were talking to someone who could no longer understand basic English. Another woman, Auntie Clara, chimed in right behind her. Auntie Clara was known for being the most vocal gossip in the congregation. She told me that shielding a rebellious, drug-addicted teenager was not an act of love, but an act of severe delusion. She told me to go home, rest my failing mind, and let the medical professionals handle my granddaughter before the girl ended up in a pine box. She patted my arm with a heavy hand, completely oblivious to the fact that she was participating in the destruction of a brilliant 17-year-old girl. The sheer audacity of these women repeating the lies of a manipulative white woman who had never even bothered to learn their last names would have broken a weaker person. A younger version of myself might have stood up in the middle of that sanctuary and shouted the absolute truth until my lungs burned. I might have grabbed Sister Beatrice by the collar and demanded she look at the complex financial ledgers I had spent my entire adult life balancing. I might have reminded them that my mind was sharp enough to run audits on multinational corporations. But I was not a younger woman, and I was certainly not a fool. I knew that reacting with anger was exactly what Chloe wanted. If I raised my voice, I would only confirm her carefully crafted narrative that I was becoming erratic and unhinged. If I cried, I would look weak and defeated, validating their misplaced pity. So I did what an auditor does best in a hostile environment. I gathered the data. While Sister Beatrice and Auntie Clara were lecturing me about my supposed dementia, I simply reached into the deep pocket of my tailored suit jacket. My fingers found the smooth glass screen of my smartphone. Without pulling the device out of my pocket, I blindly navigated to the voice memo application, relying on muscle memory. I double-tapped the screen to begin recording. I let the phone sit quietly in my pocket, capturing every single defamatory statement, every false accusation, and every piece of community gossip that Chloe had engineered. I nodded politely to the women, offering them a serene and impenetrable smile. I thanked them for their prayers and told them that the Lord always brings the absolute truth to the light. As the women walked away to return to their seats, I slowly turned my head and looked across the center aisle. Chloe was sitting next to Marcus, her head resting on his shoulder, playing the role of the exhausted martyr. But she was watching me out of the corner of her eye, waiting to see me break down. When she saw that I was looking at her, she shifted slightly. For one brief second, the mask slipped. She gave me a tiny, sharp smirk of absolute triumph. She honestly believed she had just isolated me from my entire community. She believed she had stripped me of my dignity and my credibility. I did not glare at her. I did not frown. I looked directly into her cold blue eyes, and I gave her the warmest, most pleasant smile I could possibly muster. It was the kind of smile a predator gives right before the trap snaps shut. Chloe blinked, her smirk faltering slightly as confusion crossed her face. She did not understand why I was not crying. She did not understand that she had just handed me the final piece of evidence I needed for a defamation lawsuit that would leave her entirely penniless. The church service lasted for another 2 hours. The pastor delivered a booming sermon about honesty and the consequences of bearing false witness against your neighbor. It was a deeply ironic message, considering the sheer volume of lies currently sitting in the pews. I did not hear a single word of his theological points. My mind was completely focused on the meticulously organized financial files sitting on the encrypted flash drive currently resting in the bottom of my purse. I mentally reviewed the dummy invoices, the offshore routing numbers, and the artificial intelligence voice recordings. I was assembling the legal guillotine piece by piece. When the final benediction was given, the congregation began to file out into the aisles. I stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from my navy skirt, and walked out of the heavy wooden doors into the bright Sunday afternoon sunlight. I walked with a steady, confident stride, completely ignoring the lingering whispers of the women behind me. I did not stay for the customary church luncheon in the fellowship hall. I walked straight to my car, slid into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. I pulled my phone from my pocket, stopped the audio recording, and saved the file under a highly specific code name. Then I started the engine and drove away from the neighborhood. I was not heading home to cook a traditional Sunday dinner. I drove for 45 minutes, navigating away from the affluent suburbs and into an older industrial section of the city. I parked my car in the back lot of a small diner that served cheap coffee and had no security cameras. I walked inside the diner, the bell above the door chiming softly. The air smelled of fried bacon and old grease. I walked past the empty counter and headed straight for the last booth in a dark corner. Waiting for me there, drinking black coffee and reading a printed newspaper, was an old colleague of mine from my early days in corporate auditing. He was a man who had left the private sector a decade ago because he wanted to put criminals behind bars instead of just balancing their books. He now worked as a senior investigating agent in the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I slid into the vinyl booth across from him. I placed my heavy purse on the scratched laminate table and looked him directly in the eyes. I told him we had a massive corporate fraud case to build and that I had brought him the entire map. I slid into the vinyl booth across from David. He was a man who looked exactly like the life he had chosen. His suit was slightly rumpled, and his eyes carried the permanent heavy exhaustion of someone who spends his days chasing ghosts through digital banking ledgers. We had worked together nearly 15 years ago at a major accounting firm before he decided the private sector was too corrupt and took his talents to the federal government. He was now a senior investigating agent in the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He took a sip of his black coffee and looked at me across the table. He told me that I did not look like a woman who was losing her mind. I smiled a very thin and completely humorless smile. I told him that was simply a narrative being spun by a desperate thief to cover her tracks. I reached into my heavy leather purse and pulled out the encrypted flash drive, placing it right next to his coffee cup on the scratched laminate table. David looked down at the small metal drive. He asked me what exactly I had brought him. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, letting the auditor in me take total control of the conversation. I told him I had brought him the complete financial destruction of my son's logistics company. I explained that over the past 18 months, someone had systematically and ruthlessly drained $2.5 million from the corporate operating accounts. I told him they had used dummy vendor invoices offshore holding accounts in the Cayman Islands and unauthorized merchant cash advances to bypass the internal quarterly audits. David let out a low whistle that barely rose above the hum of the diner refrigerator. He asked if my son was the one running the scheme. I shook my head slowly. I told him Marcus was incredibly arrogant and financially blind, but he was not a criminal. I told David the thief was my daughter-in-law, Chloe. And I told him she was currently trying to have me declared legally incompetent by a probate judge so she could gain complete control of my granddaughter's $5 million trust fund. She needed that trust fund to cover up the missing corporate money before the commercial lenders seized my son's physical assets. David did not ask any more questions. He understood the absolute severity of the timeline. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a heavily encrypted agency laptop. He booted it up, entered a string of complex passwords, and inserted the flash drive into the port. He spent the next 20 minutes in absolute silence. The only sound in our dark corner of the diner was the rapid clicking of his keyboard. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the bright screen as he opened the ledgers, the bank authorization logs, and the offshore routing numbers I had meticulously organized for him. When you hand a federal agent a perfectly compiled financial audit, it is like handing a starving man a grand feast. He did not have to spend months digging for subpoenas because I had already done the architectural mapping of the entire crime. David finally stopped typing and let out a heavy breath. He looked up at me and told me the level of forgery was incredibly bold. He pointed to the screen and said the bank authorization logs showed verbal confirmations for the wire transfers. He asked how a blonde white woman managed to bypass the voice recognition software at a commercial bank while pretending to be a black male chief executive officer. I explained the artificial intelligence voice generator that my granddaughter Aaliyah had witnessed her using in the middle of the night. I told him Chloe had secretly recorded my son and mapped his vocal patterns perfectly to trick the automated banking system. David nodded slowly, his face hardening into a mask of pure professional focus. He told me that using artificial intelligence to commit wire fraud was currently a massive priority for the federal government. He ran a specialized tracing program on his computer, analyzing the origin data attached to the digital banking portals. He wanted to verify exactly where the login requests had originated. A few minutes later, the screen populated with a long list of Internet Protocol addresses. David turned the laptop slightly so I could see the results. He told me that criminals always think they are smarter than the digital footprint they leave behind. He pointed to a specific string of numbers on the screen. He explained that every single time a wire transfer was initiated, the request did not come from the corporate office server downtown. It came from a residential internet service provider. But David went a crucial step further. He isolated the specific media access control address, which is the unique hardware identifier of the actual device used to access the bank. He cross-referenced it with the devices registered on my son's home wireless network. He looked me dead in the eye and confirmed that every single stolen dollar had been moved using Chloe's personal MacBook laptop. It was the absolute undeniable smoking gun. I leaned back against the vinyl booth and let out a slow breath. I asked David what the next legal steps were. He closed his laptop and slipped the encrypted drive into his suit pocket, securing the evidence. He told me that he had more than enough probable cause to initiate a massive federal sweep. He listed the charges she was facing as if he were reading a grocery list: wire fraud, bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, corporate embezzlement. He told me that because the funds crossed international borders into the Cayman Islands, it immediately triggered federal jurisdiction. He said he was going to head back to the field office right now and begin drafting the federal warrants. He needed to present the evidence to a federal magistrate judge to secure the arrest warrants and the asset freezing orders for her family. He told me it would take a massive coordination effort between his office, the local authorities, and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I asked him exactly how long it would take to get the warrants signed and ready to execute. David rubbed his jaw, calculating the bureaucratic timeline. He told me that federal judges move carefully. He said if he expedited the request through the United States Attorney, he could have the arrest warrant signed and ready by Friday evening. Friday. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with massive consequence. My mind immediately jumped to the calendar. Today was Sunday. Aaliyah's 18th birthday was this coming Friday. Friday was the exact day the $5 million trust fund legally unlocked and transferred entirely into her name. Friday was also the 15th of the month, which meant it was the exact day the logistics company payroll was scheduled to be processed. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Chloe was completely out of time, and she knew it. When the payroll bounced on Friday morning, Marcus would instantly know his company was bankrupt. The illusion of their perfect, wealthy life would shatter completely. Chloe needed to secure the medical guardianship over me and force Aaliyah to sign away the trust fund before Friday arrived. That was why she was moving so aggressively with the community smear campaign and the emergency legal petition. She was a desperate animal, backed into a very dark corner, and desperate people are capable of catastrophic mistakes. I told David that Friday was the perfect timeline, but we had to keep her completely unaware until the very last second. I told him she believed she was currently winning a family dispute over a rebellious teenager and a senile old woman. We needed her to keep focusing her entirely on me and Aaliyah so she would not check her offshore accounts or attempt to board an international flight before the FBI was ready. David agreed completely. He told me to go home, play the role of the exhausted and defeated grandmother, and let her think her legal strategy was crushing me. He promised he would handle the federal judge and have his team ready to move the moment the ink was dry on the warrants. I thanked him, paid for his black coffee, and walked out of the diner. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long orange shadows across the industrial parking lot. I felt a strange, profound sense of calm washing over me. The trap was officially set. The legal guillotine was being hoisted into the air, and the rope was securely in the hands of the federal government. All I had to do was guide my treacherous daughter-in-law to the chopping block. I got into my car, started the engine, and began the drive back to my historic neighborhood. The streets were quiet and peaceful. I was mentally preparing to sit down with Aaliyah and explain that her nightmare was almost over. I was thinking about the kind of birthday cake she might want for her 18th birthday when my thoughts were violently interrupted. The sudden sharp ringing of my cell phone echoed through the quiet cabin of my car. I glanced down at the bright screen resting in the cup holder. The caller identification displayed Chloe's name. I let it ring 3 times, taking a deep breath to steady my heart rate. I pressed the button to answer the call. Before I could say a single word, Chloe's voice floated through the speakers of my car. The malicious tone from the police station and the fake, tragic whisper from the church were completely gone. Instead, her voice was sickly sweet, dripping with a manufactured warmth that made my skin crawl. She told me she had been praying for our family all afternoon. She said she hated all this fighting and wanted to demand a sit-down meeting to settle this entire situation amicably for the sake of Marcus. The sudden sharp ringing of my cell phone echoed through the quiet cabin of my car. I glanced down at the bright screen resting in the cup holder. The caller identification displayed Chloe's name. I let it ring 3 times, taking a deep breath to steady my heart rate. I pressed the button to answer the call. Before I could say a single word, Chloe's voice floated through the speakers of my car. The malicious tone from the police station and the fake tragic whisper from the church were completely gone. Instead, her voice was sickly sweet, dripping with a manufactured warmth that made my skin crawl. She told me she had been praying for our family all afternoon. She said she hated all this fighting and wanted to demand a sit-down meeting to settle this entire situation amicably for the sake of Marcus. I sat in my parked car outside my house, letting the engine idle while I listened to the absolute audacity of the woman on the other end of the line. Just hours ago, she had been standing in the sanctuary of my church, actively trying to convince my oldest friends that my brain was deteriorating. Now she was speaking to me with the gentle, soothing tone one might use when talking to a confused child. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She was testing the waters, trying to see if her community smear campaign and the emergency guardianship petition had successfully broken my spirit. I knew exactly what I needed to do. If I responded with anger or defiance, she would know I was still fighting. If I told her I had just handed a federal agent a mountain of digital evidence proving her massive embezzlement, she would immediately empty the remaining corporate accounts and disappear before Friday. I had to give her exactly what she wanted. I had to feed her ego and validate her arrogance until she was completely blind to the trap closing around her. I closed my eyes and let my shoulders slump forward, physically relaxing my posture to alter the sound of my voice. When I finally spoke, I made sure my words were slow and slightly unsteady. I let a heavy, trembling sigh escape my lips before I answered her. I told her that I was so very tired. I let my voice crack just a fraction of an inch, making it sound fragile and completely exhausted. I told Chloe that the past few days had been overwhelming and that my heart simply could not take this kind of constant warfare anymore. I said I had read the legal petition she and Marcus had filed with the probate court. I admitted that my memory had not been as sharp lately and that maybe they were right about the heavy burden of managing such a massive estate at my advanced age. The silence on the other end of the line was thick with anticipation. I could practically hear Chloe holding her breath, waiting to see if I was actually surrendering. I continued my performance, leaning into the persona of a defeated matriarch. I told her that our family had built a respected legacy in Atlanta over the past 4 decades, and I absolutely refused to spend the final years of my life dragging our good name through a public and humiliating court battle. I said the community was already whispering about us after church this morning, and I could not bear the shame of a drawn-out legal fight over a child and a bank account. I told her I just wanted peace for myself and for my son. Chloe let out a soft, dramatic sigh of her own, completely buying the performance. She told me that peace was all she had ever wanted. She said it broke her heart to see me struggling so much and that she and Marcus only filed the petition because they loved me and wanted to take the heavy administrative responsibilities off my frail shoulders. She promised me that if I stepped aside, she would make sure Aaliyah was sent to a wonderful facility where she could get the intense psychological help she so desperately needed. She said she would personally manage the $5 million trust fund to ensure the money was protected for the future. Her greed was so incredibly transparent, it took every ounce of my self-control not to laugh out loud. She needed the legal control of that trust fund by Friday to cover the millions she had stolen, and she was practically salivating over the phone. I told her I was willing to give her exactly what she wanted, but I had one final condition. I made my voice sound desperate and pleading, like a grandmother begging for one last moment of grace. I reminded her that this coming Friday was Aaliyah's 18th birthday. It was a milestone her late mother had always dreamed of celebrating. I told Chloe that I would not sign the papers in some sterile legal office or a cold courtroom. I proposed a deal. I told Chloe she needed to host a lavish, elegant birthday dinner for Aaliyah this Friday evening. I wanted her to invite her own family and my son's business partners. I wanted a public celebration to show the world that our family was not broken and that we were moving forward together with grace. I promised Chloe that if she arranged the dinner and allowed Aaliyah to have one final beautiful evening of celebration, I would bring the legal documents directly to the restaurant. I swore to her that I would voluntarily sign over the executor powers and officially transfer the absolute control of the trust fund to her right there at the dinner table. Chloe did not even hesitate. The prospect of avoiding a court hearing and securing immediate access to $5 million on the exact day the logistics company payroll was set to bounce was too perfect for her to refuse. It solved every single one of her catastrophic financial problems in one sweeping victory. She agreed instantly. Her voice lost the fake pity and spiked with genuine excitement. She told me she knew a highly exclusive French restaurant downtown that would be absolutely perfect for the occasion. She promised to book their private dining room and invite everyone I had requested. She said she would even have her father Hunter and her brother Chad attend to show full family unity. Then the polite facade finally cracked. Having secured her prize, Chloe could not resist the urge to twist the knife one last time. She dropped the gentle tone entirely, and her voice turned cold sharp and incredibly arrogant. She told me she was glad I finally decided to stop fighting her. She said she always knew I would eventually see reason once I realized I was completely outmatched. She let out a small, condescending chuckle that echoed through the phone. She told me I was just too old for this kind of stress, Josephine. She advised me to go inside, take my medication, and get some rest before Friday. She said she would handle everything from here on out. I did not argue with her. I simply told her I would see her on Friday and ended the call. I sat in the quiet car for another minute, staring out at the large oak trees swaying in my front yard. The absolute certainty of what was about to happen settled over me like a heavy, warm blanket. Chloe had just eagerly volunteered to assemble all of my enemies in one single room. She was going to pay for an extravagant dinner, surround herself with her arrogant family, and wait for me to hand her the keys to a kingdom. She had absolutely no idea that the federal government was currently drafting warrants with her name on them, and that the dinner she was planning would be the grand stage for her complete and total destruction. I opened the car door and stepped out into the fading evening light. I walked up the brick pathway to my front porch, unlocked the heavy wooden door, and stepped into the warm, vanilla-scented air of my home. The house was quiet. I walked past my home office and climbed the carpeted stairs to the second floor. I stopped in front of the guest bedroom where Aaliyah was staying. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open gently. Aaliyah was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking down at her hands. She looked exhausted and incredibly small. The events of the weekend had drained the vibrant life out of her, leaving behind a terrified teenager who believed her entire future had been stolen by a woman her father chose over her. I walked into the room and stopped in front of the large cedar closet. When Aaliyah's mother passed away, she had left a special garment bag with me specifically instructing me to keep it safe until her daughter's 18th birthday. I had carefully preserved it for years, waiting for the right moment. I unzipped the thick canvas bag and pulled out the dress. It was a stunning designer gown. It was crafted from deep emerald green silk, the exact color of Aaliyah's birthstone. The fabric caught the soft light of the bedroom shimmering with an elegant and quiet power. It was not a dress for a frightened child. It was a dress for a young woman stepping into her own authority. I walked over to the bed and gently laid the emerald silk across Aaliyah's lap. She looked down at the beautiful fabric, her eyes widening in surprise. She reached out and touched the smooth silk, her fingers trembling slightly. She looked up at me, completely confused. She asked me what this was for and why I was giving it to her now. She reminded me that her father was trying to send her to a lockdown facility and that her birthday was completely ruined. I sat down next to her on the edge of the bed. I reached out and gently tilted her chin up, forcing her to look me directly in the eyes. I let the warm, grandmotherly softness fade away completely, replacing it with the unbreakable steel of the woman who had just orchestrated the downfall of a massive corporate fraud ring. I told her to dry her tears and stand up straight. I told her that nobody was going to send her to a facility and nobody was going to steal the future her mother had built for her. I smiled at her, a genuine, fierce smile that held the promise of absolute justice. I smoothed the emerald silk over her knees and looked deep into her eyes. "Get ready, baby," I told her, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. "We are going to a funeral disguised as a birthday party." The Friday evening air in downtown Atlanta was unseasonably warm, but I felt nothing but an absolute and terrifying cold clarity as my granddaughter and I stepped out of my car. We had arrived at El Etoile, which was widely considered the most exclusive and pretentious French dining establishment in the entire city. It was the kind of restaurant that did not list prices on the menu and required reservations months in advance. It was exactly the kind of place Chloe would choose for her grand victory lap. She wanted to perform her final act of theft surrounded by crystal chandeliers, heavy silver flatware, and an audience of wealthy spectators to validate her absolute triumph. I looked over at Aaliyah as we handed our coats to the host at the front podium. She was breathtaking. The emerald green silk dress fell perfectly around her frame, reflecting the warm amber lighting of the restaurant lobby. I had spent the entire afternoon with her, making sure her hair was perfectly styled and her posture was completely straight. She was no longer the trembling child sitting on a metal bench in a police station. She was the sole heir to a $5 million legacy, and tonight she was walking into the lion den looking exactly like royalty. I linked my arm through hers and gave her a firm, reassuring squeeze. I told her to remember everything we had discussed and to let me do all the talking. She took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and nodded. The hostess led us through the crowded main dining room and toward a heavy set of mahogany double doors at the very back of the restaurant. As the door swung open, the private dining room was revealed. It was an opulent space with walls lined with expensive vintage wine bottles and a massive crystal chandelier hanging directly over a long table covered in pristine white linen. Chloe had orchestrated the seating arrangement with the precision of a military general. She was seated at the head of the table, radiating a sickeningly triumphant energy. She was wearing a new diamond necklace and a designer dress that cost more than most people made in a month. Seated immediately to her right was my son Marcus, looking exhausted, but trying to project an air of corporate dominance. To her left sat her father Hunter, wearing a smug grin and a tailored suit he had absolutely not paid for with his own money. Next to Hunter was her brother Chad, who looked incredibly nervous, constantly bouncing his leg under the table and drinking his wine far too quickly. But Chloe had not just invited her own family. She had also invited two of the most senior business partners from my son's logistics company. These were men Marcus desperately wanted to impress. They were sitting near the middle of the table, looking somewhat confused as to why they were invited to a family birthday dinner, but happy to drink the incredibly expensive champagne Marcus was paying for. Chloe had brought them here specifically to trap me. She knew that if I caused a scene or refused to sign the documents in front of my son's most important investors, I would humiliate him completely. She was using his professional pride as a weapon to force my compliance. The conversation at the table stopped completely as Aaliyah and I walked into the room. Chloe stood up, clapping her hands together with a fake, joyful enthusiasm that echoed loudly off the wine bottles. She announced to the room that the birthday girl and the matriarch of the family had finally arrived. She walked over and tried to place her hands on Aaliyah's shoulders, but my granddaughter smoothly stepped out of her reach, pulling out her own chair and sitting down with perfect grace. I took the empty seat right next to her, placing my heavy leather purse carefully on the floor beside my feet. The dinner service began almost immediately. Waiters in crisp white uniforms brought out plates of roasted duck truffles and perfectly seared scallops. The room was filled with the sounds of clinking silver and forced polite conversation. Marcus avoided looking at me completely, choosing instead to talk loudly with his business partners about supply chain logistics and corporate expansion. Chloe spent the entire first course making sure everyone's wine glasses were full, playing the role of the perfect generous hostess, while her brother Chad continued to sweat and check his phone every 2 minutes. As the waiters cleared the main course plates, Hunter decided it was time to establish his dominance. He stood up from his chair, picking up his crystal champagne flute, and tapped it loudly with a silver spoon. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the low hum of conversation. Hunter cleared his throat and puffed out his chest, looking directly at Aaliyah and then at me. Hunter announced that he wanted to propose a toast. He smiled a cruel, predatory smile and said that family was the most important thing in the world, even when that family required making incredibly difficult decisions. He looked at Marcus's business partners and smoothly explained that our family had been going through a very tragic and challenging transition. He raised his glass slightly toward Aaliyah and said he was so thankful that troubled youth were finally getting the strict management and professional discipline they desperately needed to function in polite society. Then he looked down at me, his eyes filled with absolute condescension. He added that he was also thankful that the older generation was finally realizing when it was time to step aside and let the capable minds handle the complex burdens of wealth management. It was a brilliant and utterly disgusting speech. In 2 short sentences, he had publicly branded my granddaughter as a delinquent and confirmed the community rumor that I was losing my mind. Marcus nodded in agreement, taking a sip of his champagne, while the 2 business partners politely raised their glasses, completely unaware of the absolute poison they were participating in. I did not glare at Hunter. I did not defend my granddaughter or myself. I simply reached for my sparkling water and took a slow, measured sip. I knew that letting them enjoy their false victory now would only make the impending collapse that much more devastating. Hunter sat down looking incredibly pleased with himself. That was the exact moment Chloe made her final move. She reached down beneath the table and pulled out a massive leather-bound legal binder. She placed it directly onto the white tablecloth, pushing aside the crystal centerpieces. The binder landed with a heavy thud that sounded like a judge bringing down a gavel. She opened the thick cover, revealing hundreds of pages of dense legal text. There were dozens of little yellow sticky notes shaped like arrows, pointing to specific signature lines on the crisp white paper. Chloe looked at me, her face completely devoid of the fake sweetness she had used on the phone. Her eyes were hard and calculating. She slid the heavy binder across the smooth table until it came to a stop right in front of my plate. She told me we should get the unpleasant business out of the way so we could all enjoy the dessert course in peace. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, and instructed me to just sign on the yellow arrows Josephine. She said the documents would officially transfer the total fiduciary control of the trust fund over to her and Marcus effectively immediately. She then turned her cold gaze to Aaliyah. She slid a single separate sheet of paper toward my granddaughter. She told Aaliyah that she needed to sign the waiver, relinquishing her legal right to ever contest the transfer. Chloe smiled a tight, menacing smile and promised that if Aaliyah signed the paper, she would ensure the transport van to the behavioral facility would be gentle with her tomorrow. The entire room went completely silent. The 2 business partners shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, suddenly realizing this was not a birthday party, but a hostage negotiation. Chad stopped bouncing his leg, leaning forward with hungry, desperate eyes, waiting for the money that would save his life. I looked down at the thick legal binder. I looked at the little yellow arrows demanding I surrender $5 million to a woman who had spent the last 18 months destroying my son. Marcus leaned across the table. He picked up a heavy gold-plated pen from his suit pocket and pushed it forcefully across the tablecloth until it bumped against Aaliyah's hand. His face was a mask of stubborn, desperate ignorance. He told his daughter to do it. He looked her right in the eyes and demanded that she sign the waiver. He told Aaliyah to stop being selfish and to prove that she actually cared about the survival of this family. Aaliyah looked at the pen and then she looked at me. I gave her a single slow nod. She did not touch the pen. She simply folded her hands in her lap, sitting perfectly still in her emerald dress. I did not reach for the pen either. I slowly pushed the heavy legal binder away from me, sliding it back toward the center of the table. I looked up and locked my eyes completely onto my son. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds until Marcus finally looked away, unable to maintain the eye contact. I asked Marcus a very simple question. My voice was incredibly calm, smooth, and completely professional. I asked him how the logistics company was doing this quarter. The sudden change in subject completely derailed the momentum of the room. Chloe frowned, her eyes darting between me and her husband. Hunter scoffed, rolling his eyes at what he assumed was a symptom of my dementia, losing focus on the current task. Marcus looked incredibly relieved by the change of topic, especially in front of his business investors. He puffed up his chest, straightening his expensive tie. He smiled broadly and told me the company was doing exceptionally well. He bragged to the room that they were currently seeing record profits. He stated with absolute confidence that it was the best financial quarter they had ever recorded in the history of the enterprise. The 2 business partners nodded in agreement, smiling proudly at their successful chief executive officer. I kept my face completely neutral. I reached down to the floor and picked up my heavy leather purse. I opened the brass clasp and reached inside my fingers, wrapping around a plain manila folder. I pulled it out and placed it gently onto the white tablecloth right next to Chloe's massive legal binder. I told Marcus that I found his statement incredibly fascinating. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the words slice through the quiet room. I asked him that if the company was experiencing record profits, why exactly were his 3 largest vendor accounts currently in default? The proud smile vanished from my son's face instantly. He blinked several times, completely caught off guard. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I did not stop. I reached out and flipped open the cover of my manila folder, exposing the top document. It was a printed bank ledger marked with a bright red Federal Reserve verification stamp. I asked him why his corporate payroll account currently held a balance of less than $12,000. I asked him how he planned to pay his 200 truck drivers on the 15th of the month. Marcus stared at me, his jaw going slack. The 2 business partners stopped smiling and leaned forward, their eyes suddenly filled with genuine alarm. I turned the page in my folder, revealing a detailed spreadsheet of routing numbers and offshore accounts. I raised my voice just enough to command the absolute attention of every single person in the private dining room. I asked my son to explain to me and to his investors why exactly $2.5 million had bounced through 3 different domestic shell companies before landing in a completely untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands last Tuesday. The color completely and totally drained from my son's face. He looked as though all the blood in his body had suddenly evaporated. His skin turned a sickly pale shade of gray. He reached out with a trembling hand and pulled my manila folder toward him. Chloe let out a sharp, terrified gasp. The mask of the confident, wealthy socialite shattered into a million pieces. She lunged forward across the table, her manicured hands grasping frantically for the folder. She screamed at Marcus, telling him not to look at the papers. Her voice was shrill and completely unhinged, echoing violently in the small room. She pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed that I was entirely senile. She yelled that I was a crazy old woman and that the documents were completely fake. She begged Marcus to throw the papers away and just make me sign the trust fund binder. But Marcus did not let go of the folder. He pulled it out of her reach, his eyes locked onto the pages. He was a man who hated details, but he was not completely illiterate. He saw his own company letterhead. He saw the official bank seals. And most importantly, he saw the authorized digital signatures on the transfer requests. He looked at the long list of massive withdrawals that had slowly bled his life work completely dry. He slowly looked up from the papers and turned his head toward his wife. The look in his eyes was not anger. It was the absolute devastating horror of a man realizing he had just burned his entire life to the ground for a ghost. Marcus stared at the bank ledgers in his hands. The heavy silence in the private dining room was broken only by the sound of his ragged breathing. He traced his finger over the printed offshore account numbers and the corresponding dates. His eyes darted back and forth, processing the absolute magnitude of the betrayal. He looked up slowly, turning his head toward the woman he had defended against his own mother and his own child. Chloe was trembling, her face pale, and her perfectly applied makeup looking suddenly like a cheap plastic mask. She reached out her hand toward him, begging him to listen to her. She told Marcus that I had fabricated those documents to frame her, but Marcus just shook his head. He looked at the date of the largest wire transfer and whispered that it was the exact same day she claimed she was at the fertility clinic for an emergency procedure. The realization hit him with physical force. There were no medical bills, there were no treatments. There was only a massive financial hemorrhage designed to bleed him completely dry. He dropped the folder onto the table as if it were burning his hands. He physically recoiled from his wife, pressing his back hard against his chair, completely unable to stomach the sight of her. The thick legal binder and the single sheet of paper relinquishing the trust fund still sat directly in front of Aaliyah. The heavy gold-plated pen her father had practically shoved at her rested on the white tablecloth, reflecting the warm amber light of the crystal chandelier. Aaliyah looked at her father, a man completely broken by his own willful ignorance. Then she looked across the table at Chloe. Chloe was panting, her chest heaving with panic, completely exposed and vulnerable. Aaliyah reached out her hand, her long, slender fingers wrapped around the thick gold barrel of the pen. For a split second, Chloe let out a breathless sigh of relief, mistakenly believing that the frightened teenager was still going to follow orders and sign the documents just to escape the crushing tension of the room. But Aaliyah did not position the pen to write her signature. She raised her hand high above her shoulder, gripping the pen like a weapon. With a sudden fierce burst of energy, she brought her hand down hard. She stabbed the sharp metal tip of the pen directly into the center of the legal waiver. The force of the blow pierced completely through the thick parchment paper and bit deeply into the leather cover of the binder beneath it. Aaliyah gripped the pen tightly and ripped it downward, tearing the document violently in half. The sound of the ripping paper echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. Aaliyah did not lower her voice. She did not tremble. She looked directly into her stepmother's terrified eyes and spoke with an absolute crystal-clear authority. She told Chloe that she knew everything about the artificial intelligence voice generator. She stated loudly for everyone in the room to hear that she had been awake that night, standing outside the home office. She said she saw Chloe sitting at the desk, using the digital signature pad to forge her father's signature on the wire transfer authorization forms. Aaliyah turned her gaze toward Chad, who was sitting frozen in his chair. She pointed directly at him and announced that she had heard him crying and begging his sister for $500,000 to pay off his illegal gambling debts to the downtown syndicate. She told the entire table that Chloe had not just framed her for crashing a stolen car. Chloe had framed her to eliminate the only witness to a massive corporate robbery. The moment Aaliyah mentioned the downtown bookies, Chad completely snapped. The lazy, arrogant smirk he had worn on my front lawn disappeared entirely, replaced by the frantic, violent panic of a cornered animal. He realized that this teenage girl held the power to send him not just to prison, but to an early grave if the syndicate found out his sister's money well had dried up. Chad jumped up from the table with so much explosive force that his heavy wooden dining chair tipped backward. It crashed against the hardwood floor with a deafening thud, splintering the polished wood. He slammed his hands flat onto the white tablecloth, knocking over a bottle of expensive red wine. The dark liquid spilled across the white linen, spreading rapidly like fresh blood. He lunged his upper body across the table, his face twisted with pure, violent rage. He screamed at Aaliyah, calling her a lying little brat. He raised his fist, threatening to come across the table and shut her mouth permanently if she said another word about his business. The two business partners sitting near the center of the table immediately pushed their chairs back, standing up in sheer horror at the display of violence. But Hunter did not try to calm his son down. Hunter realized that his own luxurious lifestyle was entirely funded by the stolen money sitting in those offshore accounts. If Chloe went down, his entire financial world would collapse into absolute ruin. Hunter's face turned a violent shade of purple, the veins in his neck bulging against the collar of his tailored shirt. He slammed his own fist down onto the table, making the silverware jump and clatter against the fine china. He pointed a trembling, furious finger at me and then at Aaliyah. He roared that the entire presentation was nothing but malicious slander. His voice was deafening, shaking the crystal drops on the chandelier above us. He screamed that we had orchestrated this entire dinner just to publicly humiliate his family. He puffed out his chest, trying to summon the country club authority he relied on to intimidate people. He threatened to sue us both for every single penny we owned. He leaned forward, his face completely contorted with a sickening racial hatred, and screamed that we were nothing but ghetto trash and that we were completely done in this city. The room was a portrait of absolute chaotic destruction. Chad was panting heavily, restrained only by the width of the table. Hunter was red-faced and screaming legal threats into the air. Chloe had buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as her perfect life disintegrated into dust. Marcus sat completely paralyzed, staring at his wife as if she were a monster he had never truly seen before. The business partners were already reaching for their suit jackets, desperate to escape the disastrous liability of the dinner. The noise, the yelling, the threats of physical violence and legal ruin swirled around the private dining room like a violent hurricane. But at the very center of the storm, I remained entirely untouched. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice to shout over Hunter. I simply reached out with a steady, elegant hand and picked up my crystal glass of sparkling water. The ice clinked softly against the sides as I brought the rim to my lips. I took a slow, deliberate, and refreshing sip. I gently placed the glass back down onto the white tablecloth right next to the spilled red wine. I looked up at Hunter, my eyes completely cold and devoid of any fear. I kept my voice incredibly soft, but the absolute certainty in my tone cut through his screaming like a razor blade. I told him he could not sue me. I smiled a very small, chilling smile. I told him he could definitely try to find a good defense attorney. I looked toward the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the room and told him he would need one because they were already here. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the private dining room did not simply open. They swung inward with a heavy authoritative force that immediately sucked the remaining air out of the room. 4 figures stepped into the warm amber light of the crystal chandelier. Leading the group was David, my old colleague from the corporate auditing world, now wearing a sharp dark suit with a heavy federal badge clipped to his leather belt. Behind him stood another federal agent and 2 uniformed local police officers resting their hands securely on their duty belts. The loud, chaotic screaming of Hunter and Chad died instantly. The sudden commanding presence of federal law enforcement in a high-end French restaurant is not something that can be argued with or intimidated. The 2 business partners sitting near the center of the table took one look at the federal badges and immediately grabbed their suit jackets. They practically ran out of the side door, desperate to completely distance themselves from whatever criminal disaster was unfolding. David walked directly toward the table, his eyes sweeping the room before locking onto his targets. He did not raise his voice, but his tone was absolute and completely uncompromising. He nodded toward Chad, who was still standing over the spilled red wine, panting heavily. David instructed the 2 uniformed local officers to secure the suspect. Chad did not try to fight. The moment the local officers stepped forward and grabbed his arms, pulling them forcefully behind his back, his entire arrogant facade crumbled into dust. The lazy smirk and the violent threats were entirely gone. He began to sob like a frightened child, begging the officers to be careful, claiming he had done nothing wrong. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly, echoing with a sharp metallic finality in the silent room. David looked directly at Chad and informed him that he was under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud and money laundering. Chloe was completely frozen in her chair at the head of the table. She looked like a trapped animal, her eyes darting frantically toward the exits, finding a federal agent blocking every single path. David turned his attention to her. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper bearing the official seal of a federal magistrate judge. He looked down at my daughter-in-law and announced that she was being placed under immediate arrest for aggravated identity theft, corporate embezzlement, and felony wire fraud. That was the moment Hunter suddenly found his voice. He puffed out his chest, stepping aggressively toward the federal agents, trying to physically shield his daughter. He tried to invoke his country club privilege, assuming that white wealthy men were immune to sudden consequences. He demanded that the agents leave the private room, immediately claiming they had absolutely no right to interrupt a family dinner without a warning. He pointed a trembling finger at David and threatened to call the police commissioner, whom he claimed was a close personal friend. He shouted that this was a massive misunderstanding and a vicious slander campaign orchestrated by me. David did not even blink. He looked at Hunter with pure professional disgust. He told Hunter that he could make all the phone calls he wanted from a payphone. David took a step closer, forcing Hunter to back up against the expensive wine racks lining the wall. David informed him that as of 5 minutes ago, a federal judge had signed an emergency injunction freezing every single personal banking account, investment portfolio, and liquid asset under Hunter's name. David explained with terrifying calmness that because Hunter had knowingly received stolen corporate funds to pay for his luxury lifestyle and his country club memberships, he was officially under active investigation as an accessory to massive federal fraud. Hunter's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The blood completely drained from his flushed face. He staggered backward, hitting the wall, as the sheer devastating realization hit him. He was not just losing his daughter to the federal prison system. He was entirely penniless. He had lost the only thing he truly cared about in the entire world, which was his manufactured wealthy image. Chloe realized there was absolutely no escape. The legal loopholes were closed, and the offshore accounts were frozen. She resorted to the only weapon she had ever successfully used in her entire life. She threw herself out of her chair and collapsed onto the floor directly at my son's feet. She clutched the fabric of Marcus' pant leg, burying her face against his knee. She began to wail, producing her signature dramatic white tears, sobbing so hard her whole body shook. She begged him to protect her, crying that she only did it because she loved him and wanted to build a perfect life for them. She pleaded with Marcus to call his corporate lawyers to fix this terrible mistake and to not let them take her away. But her tears held absolutely no power anymore. Marcus did not move. He did not reach down to comfort her, and he did not yell at the officers. He sat completely paralyzed in his chair, staring straight ahead at the torn legal binder on the white tablecloth. He looked down at his wife sobbing on the floor, performing the exact same theatrical desperation she had used in the police station when she tried to throw his daughter in jail. He finally understood the absolute truth. The woman he had chosen over his own flesh and blood had systematically and ruthlessly destroyed his entire existence. The two federal agents stepped forward, ignoring her frantic screaming. They pulled Chloe up from the floor by her arms, forcibly pulling them behind her back. She thrashed and kicked her designer dress, tearing at the seams, but the agents easily overpowered her, locking her wrists tightly into heavy handcuffs. Chloe was dragged toward the heavy double doors, screaming hysterically, her perfect life completely shattered into 1,000,000 unrecoverable pieces. I sat quietly in my chair, taking another sip of my sparkling water, feeling absolutely nothing but the pure, profound satisfaction of justice served. But the night was not quite over. I set my glass down and turned my attention back to my son, because I had one final piece of business to settle with Marcus. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind the federal agents, cutting off the frantic, hysterical screams of my daughter-in-law. The absolute silence that fell over the private dining room was deafening. The two business partners were long gone. Chad and Chloe were on their way to a federal holding cell. Hunter had stumbled out of the restaurant, a broken and penniless man clutching his chest as he tried to comprehend his sudden total financial ruin. The only people left in the opulent room were me, my granddaughter Aaliyah, and my son Marcus. The spilled red wine dripped slowly from the edge of the white tablecloth, pattering softly onto the polished hardwood floor. Marcus remained sitting in his chair, staring blankly at the empty space where his wife had just been kneeling. He was completely paralyzed. The arrogant chief executive officer was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow shell of a man who had just watched his entire universe collapse. He slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes were red and filled with genuine, desperate tears. He reached a trembling hand across the table toward me. He sobbed and told me that the company was completely ruined. He begged me to help him. He said I had to bail him out and use my retirement savings to cover the missing millions so the lenders would not take his trucks and his warehouse. He told me he was my only son and that I could not let him go to federal bankruptcy court. I looked at the tears streaming down his face, and I felt absolutely no pity. I did not reach out to take his trembling hand. Instead, I calmly pushed my chair back and stood up. I smoothed the wrinkles from my tailored navy skirt and picked up my heavy leather purse from the floor. I looked down at my son with the cold, calculating eyes of a senior auditor who had just finished closing the books on a catastrophic failure. I reminded Marcus of a conversation we had 10 years ago in my home office. I told him that when he came to me begging for the $2 million in seed money to start Caldwell Logistics, I did not just hand him a blank check out of the goodness of my heart. I explained that in exchange for fully funding his corporate dream, I required him to sign a master operating agreement that quietly granted me a 51% silent stake in the company. I told him I had kept that majority ownership completely hidden for a decade. I never exercised my voting rights, and I never interfered with his daily operations because I wanted him to be a man. I wanted him to build a legacy he could be proud of. But I told him that a man who blindly allows a thief to drain his corporate accounts and then tries to throw his own teenage daughter into a juvenile detention center to protect that thief is not a man at all. He is a massive financial and moral liability. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the white tablecloth, and delivered the final absolute blow. I told him that as the majority shareholder of Caldwell Logistics, I was officially firing him from his position as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. I cited gross financial negligence and absolute breach of fiduciary duty. I told him I would be bringing in my own forensic accountants on Monday morning to liquidate whatever assets were left to pay the innocent truck drivers he had betrayed. I told him he was entitled to absolutely nothing. Marcus gasped, clutching his chest, as if he had been physically struck. In a single night, he had lost his treacherous wife to the federal prison system, his prestigious company to his own mother, and his beautiful daughter to his own unforgivable ignorance. Aaliyah stood up from her chair, her emerald green silk dress rustling softly in the quiet room. She did not say a single word to her father. She did not even look at him. She simply linked her arm through mine, and we walked out of the private dining room, leaving Marcus completely alone with the spilled wine and the shattered remnants of his life. Exactly 1 month later, the atmosphere could not have been more completely different. It was a beautiful golden Sunday afternoon, and my historic brick house was filled to the absolute brim with the sounds of genuine joy and unshakable peace. The heavy, suffocating tension that had plagued our family for the past 18 months was entirely gone. In its place was the rich, warm scent of a traditional Sunday dinner wafting from the kitchen. I had spent the entire morning cooking, preparing massive cast-iron pots of simmered collard greens, perfectly baked macaroni and cheese, golden sweet cornbread, and slow-roasted chicken. The dining room table, the one that actually belonged to my family and not to a pretentious French restaurant, was crowded with aunts, uncles, and cousins who truly loved and supported us. At the very center of it all was Aaliyah. She had officially turned 18 years old. The dark, heavy shadows under her eyes had completely vanished. She was sitting next to her favorite cousin, laughing so hard she had to wipe joyful tears from her cheeks. She was radiant, completely thriving in an environment where she was finally safe and deeply valued. The $5 million trust fund had legally and smoothly transferred entirely into her name without a single complication. Chloe was currently sitting in a federal detention center awaiting trial, completely unable to touch a single penny of my granddaughter inheritance. Marcus had moved into a small apartment on the other side of the city, drowning in civil lawsuits from his former business partners. We had not spoken to him since that night at the restaurant, and neither Aaliyah nor I felt any desire to break that silence. Aaliyah was no longer carrying the crushing weight of being the family's scapegoat. She was already busy touring university campuses, preparing to study finance and law so she could protect others the way I had protected her. I stood near the doorway of the dining room, holding a cup of hot peppermint tea, simply watching the beautiful chaos of a family that had finally healed. The audit was officially closed, and the accounts were perfectly balanced. The toxic elements had been permanently removed, and the foundation of our family was finally secure. I took a slow, peaceful sip of my tea, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. Have you ever had to stand completely firm and use the cold, hard truth to dismantle a toxic person who was trying to destroy your family? It is an incredibly painful and terrifying journey, but the peace that follows the storm is worth every single difficult step. If my story resonated with you today, please let me know in the comments below. Share this video with anyone who might need a reminder that no amount of manipulative tears can ever defeat undeniable proof. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of ultimate justice and personal triumph. Remember that you do not always have to raise your voice to win the battle. Sometimes you just have to wait for the perfect moment to show them the receipts. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next story. The greatest lesson from this ordeal is that true power does not roar, it calculates. Manipulators rely on loud theatrics, fake tears, and social pressure to bend reality to their will. They exploit the insecurities of enablers to isolate their victims and steal their future. But the truth is always hiding in the quiet details. When faced with a toxic family member trying to destroy your life, you must remove your emotions from the equation. Do not argue with their lies. Simply gather your evidence, protect those who truly matter, and wait for the perfect moment to let the facts speak. If you have ever had to use cold, hard facts to expose a toxic manipulator in your own family, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share your story in the comments below.